Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The shadows in my office have never been still. They dance with the flicker of fluorescent lights, stretching and contracting as the ancient building settles. But tonight, as the clock ticked past midnight, I saw a shadow that didn't belong to anything in this world. A shadow that moved with purpose. A shadow that knew my name. The Harrington building project was killing me. 3 weeks behind schedule, with the client breathing down my neck and demanding changes that threatened the structural integrity of the entire design. As the senior architect at Meridian Associates, the responsibility fell squarely on my shoulders. That's why I was still at my desk at midnight on a Friday, long after everyone else had gone home to their families, their friends, their lives. I had none of those things anymore. Not since the divorce. Not since the incident. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I adjusted measurements and recalculated load-bearing capacities. The office was silent except for the soft clicking of keys and the occasional hum of the heating system kicking on to fight the October chill. I rubbed my eyes, feeling the familiar burn of exhaustion. The coffee in my mug had gone cold hours ago, but I took another sip anyway, grimacing at the bitter taste. A flicker caught my eye, something moving in the conference room across the hall. My office door stood open, offering a clear view through the glass walls of the meeting space. I paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard, and squinted into the darkness. Nothing, just my imagination. I'd been staring at blueprints too long. I returned to my work, but a chill crawled up my spine, raising goosebumps along my arms. The temperature in the room seemed to drop suddenly. My breath fogged in front of my face. This old building had always had heating issues, but this was different. The cold felt intentional, focused. A faint tapping sound drew my attention back to the conference room. Tap, 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 like fingernails on glass. I rose from my chair, my knees cracking after hours of sitting. The rational part of my brain suggested it was just the building settling, or perhaps a branch against a window. But something deeper, something primal, whispered that I should grab my coat and leave. I ignored that voice. I've always been a skeptic, a man of science and concrete and steel. There are no such things as ghosts. The conference room was dark as I approached, illuminated only by the glow of emergency exit signs and the distant lights of the city filtering through the windows. I reached for the light switch by the door, but before I could flip it, I saw it. A shadow. Tall, impossibly tall, stretching from floor to ceiling. The silhouette of a man in what appeared to be an old-fashioned suit, complete with the outline of a bowler hat. But where the face should have been, 2 glowing red points pierced the darkness like embers. My heart slammed against my ribcage. Sweat broke out across my forehead despite the cold. I blinked hard, certain my exhaustion was causing me to hallucinate. The shadow remained, and then it moved. It glided across the conference room, not walking but floating several inches above the carpet. No footsteps, no sound at all except for a faint buzzing that seemed to vibrate inside my skull, rather than in the air around me. I stood frozen, my hand still outstretched toward the light switch, as the shadow approached the glass wall separating us. Michael Harlow. The voice wasn't spoken aloud. It resonated inside my head, dry and crackling like ancient paper being unfurled. The man who builds towers on the graves of the forgotten. My mouth went bone dry. I tried to speak, to demand how this thing knew my name, but my vocal cords seemed paralyzed. You believe you're the first to claim this land? To impose your vision upon it? How quickly humanity forgets its sins. The shadow pressed against the glass, its form distorting as if trying to seep through the barrier between us. Those red eyes fixed on me with terrible intelligence. My legs trembled, urging me to run, but some morbid fascination kept me rooted to the spot. You still blame yourself for Sarah leaving, for the child you never had, for the accident that wasn't really an accident. Ice flooded my veins. No one knew about that night, about the argument, the car, the rain-slicked roads, about how I'd reached for her arm when she'd tried to exit the vehicle, causing her to hit the accelerator instead of the brake, how we'd nearly plunged off the overpass, how she'd looked at me afterward with such horror, such realization of how toxic we'd become, how she'd walked away forever that night, refusing to even speak to me during the divorce proceedings. No one knew. I'd told no one. Behind the shadow, papers on the conference table began to rustle. Slowly at first, then with gathering force until they swirled through the air like leaves caught in an autumn gale. My frozen limbs finally responded to my brain's desperate commands. I lunged for the light switch, flipping it on. The fluorescent lights buzzed to life, flooding the room with harsh illumination. The papers settled. The shadow remained. In the light, it seemed even more wrong, more impossible. A hole in reality shaped like a man, absorbing the brightness around it. The red eyes pulsed, contracting like pupils adjusting to the sudden glare. I stumbled backward, my shoulder blades hitting the wall of the corridor. My breath came in short, painful gasps. The beginnings of a panic attack tightened my chest. On my desk, my computer chimed. New windows were opening on the screen, though I was at least 15 feet away from it. File folders I hadn't accessed in months, years even, began flying open. I watched, transfixed in horror, as my monitor filled with images I'd never seen before. Architectural drawings, but not mine. Old, rendered in a style dating back to the early 1900s. The very building I was standing in, but labeled differently. Eastern State Psychiatric Hospital, West Wing. My office, this entire floor, had once been where the most troubled souls were housed. The voice in my head finished my thought. Where they tried to cut the demons out. The images on my screen changed, showing photographs now instead of blueprints. Black and white, grainy, showing men in white coats standing over patients strapped to tables. Surgical instruments laid out in neat rows. Machines with dials and probes that I couldn't identify but instinctively understood were designed to cause pain, to cure through suffering. The buzzing in my skull intensified until I thought my head would split open. I pressed my palms against my temples, a groan escaping my lips. Through my fingers, I watched as the shadow oozed through the glass wall of the conference room, impossible as that was, and glided into the hallway where I stood. Your firm purchased this property for a song, the voice continued, never questioning why it had stood empty for decades, never asking about the bodies found in the walls during the first renovation attempt in 1963, never wondering why 3 construction workers went mad during the conversion to offices in 1978. I hadn't known. How could I have known? I'd only been with Meridian for 8 years. The building had been the company headquarters long before I arrived. The shadow loomed closer. I could smell it now, the scent of old chemicals, formaldehyde and ether, undercut with something putrid. I gagged, pressing myself harder against the wall, wishing I could phase through it as easily as this thing had moved through glass. You recognize this place in your bones, don't you, Michael? Some part of you has always known what happened here. Why else would you avoid staying after dark? Why else would you feel watched in the east stairwell? Your body remembers what your mind cannot. And terrifyingly, I did feel a spark of recognition. How many times had I felt uneasy in certain parts of the building? How often had I heard whispers just at the edge of perception when working late? I dismissed it all as stress, as an overactive imagination. But now, the shadow extended what might have been an arm, reaching for me. I finally found my voice, letting out a strangled cry as I dodged to the side, stumbling back toward my office. I slammed the door shut behind me, though I knew intuitively that conventional barriers meant nothing to this entity. Sure enough, the shadow seeped under the door like black smoke, reforming into its tall, suited shape on the other side. Those burning eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. You architects are all the same, it said, building your monuments on blood-soaked ground, covering the screams with concrete and glass, pretending the past can be buried under modern lines and clean facades. My desk chair rolled toward me of its own accord, hitting the backs of my knees and forcing me to sit. My computer monitor continued to display images that grew increasingly disturbing. Patients with vacant eyes, their skulls partially opened, journals documenting treatments that were nothing short of torture, a list of deaths classified as therapeutic failures. And then, most chillingly, a photograph of a doctor standing in front of the hospital. Tall, lean, wearing a tailored suit and bowler hat from the early 1900s. His face was partially obscured by shadow, but his eyes seemed to reflect the camera flash with an unnatural redness. Dr. Edward Merrick, the caption read, Chief of Experimental Procedures, Eastern State Psychiatric Hospital, 1901-1924. The shadow man was directly in front of me now, those terrible eyes level with mine as I sat trembling in my chair. The temperature had dropped so low that I could see my breath crystallizing in the air between us. I had such grand ambitions, Michael, the voice whispered in my mind. I sought to extract madness like a tumor, to cut away the parts of the mind that harbored darkness. But you cannot excise what is fundamental to humanity. My patients taught me that slowly, as they screamed and begged and eventually fell silent. You're not real, I finally managed to say, my voice cracking. You're a hallucination. I'm overworked, exhausted. Is that what you told yourself after Sarah left? That your guilt wasn't real? That the blood on your hands was imaginary? There was no blood, I shouted, a surge of anger cutting through my fear. It was an accident. I never meant to hurt her. Intent means nothing. Results are all that remain. The shadow seemed to expand, filling my peripheral vision until there was nothing else. Just as your intent means nothing now. This building remembers what was done here. The pain has seeped into the foundation, the support beams, the very air you breathe. My computer chirped again. New images appeared, blueprints for the Harrington building, my current project. Except they were overlaid with older drawings, showing how the new structure's footprint perfectly matched another wing of the old asylum that had been demolished decades ago. You're rebuilding it, the voice said, something like satisfaction coloring its tone. Without even knowing, the walls that contained so much suffering will rise again under your direction. And they remember, Michael. Buildings remember. My hands moved to the keyboard without my conscious direction. I watched, horrified, as my fingers typed out an email to the Harrington client, attaching revised plans that I hadn't created, plans that subtly altered the interior layout to create spaces that corresponded exactly with the rooms shown in the asylum documents. Treatment rooms, isolation cells, the surgical theater where Dr. Merrick had performed his procedures. I tried to pull my hands away, but they continued typing, finalizing the email, hovering over the send button. You will be my hands now, the shadow, Dr. Merrick said. My work was interrupted, but it need not end. There are still sick minds to cure, still demons to extract, and you will build me the perfect venue for my continuing research. Something broke inside me then. Some final thread of rational denial snapped. With a roar of defiance, I swept my arm across the desk, knocking the monitor to the floor with a crash of breaking glass. I leapt to my feet, sending the chair flying backward. No, I shouted into that featureless face with its burning eyes. I won't be part of this. Whatever happened here is over. I lunged for the door, but it slammed shut before I could reach it. The handle refused to turn under my desperate grip. Behind me, I heard my computer beep. The monitor was broken, but the tower still functioned. The email was sending itself. You cannot stop what is already in motion, Merrick's voice echoed in my skull. The groundbreaking ceremony is next week. The first shovel will turn earth that has tasted blood before, and once construction begins, I will have a new domain. My breath came in ragged gasps as I yanked futilely at the door handle. Sweat poured down my face despite the freezing temperature. The buzzing in my head had become a roar that threatened to drown out all thought. Then suddenly, clarity. I turned back to face the shadow, my fear still present but now controlled, channeled into determination. You're right that buildings remember, I said, my voice steadier than I would have thought possible. But so do I. And I remember who I am, what I do. I stepped away from the door, moving to my drafting table where the physical blueprints for the Harrington building lay spread out. I'm an architect. I don't just design buildings, I understand them. Their strengths. I ran my hand over the plans. And their weaknesses. The shadow wavered slightly, the red eyes flickering. This building you're haunting? I know why it's still standing after all these years. I know which walls are load-bearing, which supports are critical. I know how it could be changed, improved, or condemned. I met those burning eyes without flinching now. If your spirit is bound to this structure, what happens if it's demolished? If I submit a report detailing the structural deficiencies I've been noticing for years, the cracks in the foundation, the water damage to the support beams, the outdated electrical system that poses a fire hazard? The temperature dropped further, frost crystallizing on the windows. Papers whirled around the room in a furious cyclone, but I stood my ground. Or perhaps I should look into the history of this place more thoroughly. Bring to light what happened here. The experiments, the deaths. Make it public knowledge. Turn your private hell into a cautionary tale. You would be ruined, Merrick's voice hissed. Your firm implicated in the cover-up. Your career ended. Maybe, I conceded. But buildings can be rebuilt. Careers restarted. Some things are worth the sacrifice. I reached for a red marker and with deliberate strokes began to circle areas on the Harrington blueprints, not following Merrick's twisted modifications, but making my own changes. Alterations that would preserve the structure's integrity while completely changing its internal flow and layout. The Harrington building will not be your new domain, I said, continuing to mark up the plans. It will be a monument to light, to healing through proper care and compassion. I'll make sure of it. Something like uncertainty flickered in those red eyes. The shadow contracted slightly, becoming less all-encompassing. You cannot undo what has been done here, Merrick insisted, but his voice seemed fainter in my mind. No, I agreed, but I can ensure it never happens again. Not through my hands, not through my work. I took out my phone, opened the camera, and began photographing the historical images still displayed on my computer tower's secondary monitor that had escaped damage. Evidence. The shadow lunged at me one last time, a final desperate attempt to maintain its influence. I felt a coldness pass through me, a momentary disorientation, as foreign memories flashed before my eyes. Surgical theaters, screaming patients, the satisfaction of wielding absolute power over vulnerable minds. Merrick trying to make me understand his vision, to sympathize with his mission. But I rejected it all. These were not my desires, not my legacy. The shadow recoiled as if struck, its form becoming less distinct, more smoke than silhouette. The red eyes dimmed, fading from burning coals to dying embers. This is not the end, Merrick's voice whispered, now distant, as if coming from the bottom of a well. The past is never truly buried. No, I said quietly, but we can learn from it, build something better on the foundation of understanding. The shadow dispersed like mist before the morning sun, dissolving into wisps that faded into the corners of the room. The temperature began to rise, the oppressive presence lifting. My office door clicked, the lock disengaging. I stood there for a long moment, breathing deeply, uncertain if it was truly over, or if Merrick had simply retreated to gather his strength. But something told me I had won this encounter, even if the war might continue. Dawn was breaking outside my window, pale light filtering through the blinds. I had spent the entire night facing down a ghost, or perhaps a manifestation of this building's terrible past. I was exhausted, shaken to my core, but also strangely invigorated. I gathered the marked-up Harrington plans, the photographs I'd taken of the asylum documents, and my notes about the structural issues in this building. There would be consequences for what I was about to do, certainly. Professional repercussions, possibly legal ones if my firm had indeed known about this building's history when they purchased it. But as I walked out of my office and down the hallway toward the elevator, I felt lighter than I had in years. The burden of my past mistakes with Sarah still weighed on me, but I understood now that guilt could either crush you or transform you. I was choosing transformation. The building seemed different in the early morning light, just an old structure of concrete and steel, with no shadows where they shouldn't be. But I knew better now. I knew that places held memories, that trauma could echo through decades, and I knew that as an architect, I had a responsibility, not just to those who would use my buildings in the future, but to honor and respect what had come before. To build not on denial and forgetting, but on acknowledgement and healing. As I stepped outside into the crisp October morning, I took one last look at the old Meridian building. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of bringing its dark history to light. Tomorrow, I would start redesigning the Harrington project with a new purpose in mind. But today, in this moment, I simply allowed myself to feel the sun on my face and to breathe without the weight of shadows pressing down upon me. Story 2. The forest fell silent as I approached the cave. Not the peaceful quiet of nature at rest, but the suffocating stillness that precedes catastrophe. Even the birds had stopped singing, as if they knew better than to announce their presence in this part of the woods. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees in the span of a few steps, my breath now visible in small, frightened clouds before my face, and there it was, a dark mouth in the hillside that shouldn't exist, on no trail map I'd studied, in no guidebook I'd read about Black Pine Reserve. Yet it called to me, not just metaphorically. I could hear it whispering my name. I had always been a solitary hiker. The tranquility of the forest, far from the chaos of city life, was my sanctuary. At 30, I had reached a point where weekend wilderness excursions became not just a hobby, but a necessity, oxygen for a suffocating soul. Black Pine Reserve was unfamiliar territory, a 5-hour drive from my apartment, but its reputation for pristine trails and challenging terrain had drawn me in. The ranger at the entrance booth had barely looked up when handing me a map, mumbling something about staying on marked paths and being out before sunset. Standard warnings I'd heard 100 times before. The first 3 hours of hiking had been exactly what I'd hoped for, demanding enough to quiet my mind, with views worth the exertion. I had planned to loop back by early afternoon, but a peculiar rock formation in the distance caught my attention. The map showed nothing in that direction, but my curiosity pushed me forward. Just a quick detour, I told myself. The forest began to change as I ventured off trail. The pines grew closer together, their needles blocking more sunlight than seemed possible. The undergrowth thinned, then disappeared altogether, leaving only a thick carpet of rotting needles that muffled my footsteps. The air grew heavy, clinging to my skin like damp silk. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't place what exactly had shifted. It was as if the forest itself had become aware of my presence. When I first spotted the cave entrance, I assumed it was just a shadow cast by overlapping rocks. But as I approached, the darkness solidified into a genuine opening, a perfect arch about 7 feet high cut into the hillside. The stone around it was smooth, almost polished, unlike the jagged formations throughout the rest of the reserve. I pulled out my map again, unfolding it completely. Nothing. This significant geological feature simply didn't exist according to official records. My hiking boots crunched on something brittle. Looking down, I noticed small animal bones scattered near my feet. Not unusual in forests, but these seemed deliberately arranged in concentric circles leading toward the cave. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. That's when I heard it. My name, whispered so faintly I thought I'd imagined it. But then it came again, slightly louder, a voice that somehow bypassed my ears and materialized directly inside my head. Michael. I froze, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. Nobody knew I was here. I hadn't told anyone about this hike. Not my colleagues, not my few friends, certainly not my estranged family. I had intentionally sought anonymity in this distant reserve. Michael, come see. The voice was neither male nor female, young nor old. It existed in some uncanny valley of sound that set my teeth on edge. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly bone dry. Logic insisted I turn around, retrace my steps to the marked trail, but my feet moved forward instead, drawn by a curiosity I couldn't explain. The temperature plummeted with each step closer to the cave. My breath plumed before me in increasingly dense clouds. In August, in Tennessee, impossible. I hugged my light jacket tighter around myself, cursing my decision to leave my pack with extra layers back at the fork in the trail. The cold penetrated my clothing, seeping into my bones with unnatural speed. My smartwatch vibrated on my wrist. A low battery warning. Impossible again. I'd charged it fully before setting out just 4 hours ago. I glanced down at the screen just as it flickered and froze, the digits reading 333. I tapped the face, then pressed the side button, but the display remained locked in place. Dead. The unease that had been building in my stomach crystallized into genuine fear. Something was very wrong here. I reached for my phone, which showed no service, expected in remote areas, but it too had died. For the first time, I registered the complete silence surrounding me. No distant birds, no rustling leaves, no scurrying wildlife. Just silence and the whispers. Michael, we've waited so long. The voices were plural now, overlapping like a crowd murmuring in a vast cathedral. I pulled out my compass, the old-fashioned backup I always carried. The needle spun wildly, rotating in complete circles with increasing speed until it was just a red blur. I dropped it like it had burned me, watching it disappear in the thick layer of pine needles. A cracking sound above made me look up sharply. A massive branch was falling, directly toward me. I dove sideways, the dead wood missing me by inches as it crashed to the ground. Before I could recover, another branch fell to my right, then another to my left. I scrambled backward, watching in horrified fascination as more branches broke free from trees that didn't appear damaged or diseased. The branches weren't falling randomly. Each landed with precision, forming what became unmistakably a pattern on the forest floor. I backed away further until I could see the arrangement in its entirety. A complex symbol reminiscent of something I'd seen in an old book on occult practices. My undergraduate anthropology courses had touched briefly on ancient religious symbols, but this was something else entirely. More complex, more unsettling, and definitely not meant to ward off evil. My back hit rough stone, and I realized I'd retreated all the way to the cave entrance. The whispers grew excited, like a crowd spotting a celebrity in their midst. You've come. Finally come. Join us. Become us. The rational part of my brain screamed danger, urged me to run, to get as far from this place as possible. But something deeper, more primitive, kept me rooted in place. A horrifying thought surfaced. What if I wasn't the first person to find this cave? What if others had stood exactly where I stood now, hearing these same whispers? Against every instinct for self-preservation, I reached into my pocket for my flashlight. The small beam seemed to be swallowed by the darkness rather than penetrating it. But it revealed enough. The cave floor sloped gently downward, the walls unnaturally smooth. And there, just beyond where the light failed, I thought I saw movement. My lungs constricted, each breath becoming more difficult than the last. The air near the cave entrance was so cold it hurt to inhale. I could feel my nostrils freezing, the moisture in my eyes crystallizing at the corners. This wasn't natural cold. It was the absence of heat, the negation of warmth itself. The presence I'd sensed earlier solidified in my mind, ancient, patient, and utterly malevolent. It had been waiting for someone like me, someone alone and unprotected, someone curious enough to ignore warning signs, someone nobody would miss for days, possibly weeks. I took one step into the cave, then another. The darkness wrapped around me like a living thing, hungry and intimate. The whispering intensified, becoming almost a physical sensation against my skin. Words and languages that had never known written form filled my head, somehow comprehensible despite their alienness. They told me of what waited deeper within, entities older than humanity, older than the forest itself. Beings that had been imprisoned when the continents were still one landmass, when different stars dominated the night sky. They offered knowledge and experiences beyond human comprehension. All they needed was a vessel, a bridge back into the world they had once ruled. My foot struck something solid. A book, its leather binding cracked and stained. I picked it up, hands trembling so violently I nearly dropped it. The pages were filled with cramped handwriting, the same symbol I'd seen outside repeated throughout the text. The journal entry on the first page was dated just 3 years earlier. I've found it. After decades of searching, the doorway described in the ancient texts. The voices have confirmed my purpose. I am to be their emissary. They have shown me wonders and horrors beyond imagination. Tomorrow I go deeper. I will become immortal through communion with them. The handwriting matched one I knew well, my Uncle Robert's distinctive script, with its peculiar slant and sharp angles. Uncle Robert, who had disappeared during a solo research trip 3 years ago. Uncle Robert, whose interest in obscure mythology and ancient religions had been dismissed as eccentric by our family. Uncle Robert, who had sent me a letter just before his disappearance, rambling about a discovery that would change humanity's understanding of its place in the cosmos. The letter I had ignored, filing away as the ravings of a man descending into mental illness. My head spun with implications. This couldn't be coincidence. Something had guided me here, had been guiding me for years, perhaps. The whispers grew more insistent, more seductive. They promised I would understand everything if I just came a little deeper, if I just surrendered to their embrace. My body moved without conscious direction, each step taking me further into the cave. The darkness was absolute now, my flashlight's beam completely extinguished by whatever force permeated this place. I could feel presences around me, beside me, within me. Clawed fingers that weren't fingers at all brushed against my face with terrible tenderness. Join us. Complete the circle. The door must open. The time is now. Images flooded my mind. Stars going dark one by one. The sun dimming to a cold red ember. The earth transforming into something alien and hostile to human life. I saw myself standing before cowing masses, my body no longer entirely my own, channeling powers that could reshape reality itself. I saw family, friends, strangers, all with empty eyes, worshiping the thing I would become. My back hit the cave wall as I instinctively recoiled from the visions. The stone felt wrong against my palms. Not cold mineral, but something organic, something that pulsed with a hideous mockery of life. I yanked my hands away, a scream building in my throat that I couldn't release. I thought of Uncle Robert, wondering if he had experienced these same visions, if he had embraced them. Had he walked willingly into communion with these entities? Or had he, in some final moment of clarity, tried to escape as I desperately wanted to now? The journal fell from my numb fingers as I fumbled for the flashlight I'd dropped. Instead, my hand closed around something else, smooth, cylindrical, metallic. A flare. Not mine. I never carried flares. But I recognized it instantly as the type Uncle Robert always packed for his expeditions. My fingers, moving with a coordination that seemed separate from my panic-stricken mind, twisted the cap. The flare ignited with a harsh hiss, bathing the cave in crimson light. What I saw in that moment will haunt me until my dying day. The cave walls weren't stone at all, but a vast membrane, translucent and veined, pulsing with slow, deliberate rhythm. Suspended within this membrane were shapes, human shapes, dozens of them in various stages of absorption. Some were recent enough to recognize as human. Others had been transformed into something that retained only the vaguest suggestion of their original form. And there, nearest to me, a figure I recognized despite the changes that had overtaken it. The hollow cheeks, the aquiline nose, the high forehead. Uncle Robert's features were still discernible beneath the gray, waxy flesh. His eyes opened as the flare's light touched him. Not the kind brown eyes I remembered, but bottomless pits reflecting the same ancient malevolence I'd sensed outside. His mouth moved, forming my name without sound. Then his hand, no longer entirely a hand, reached toward me, stretching the membrane that contained him until it bulged obscenely in my direction. The voices crescendoed into a cacophony of demand and promise and threat. The membrane throughout the cave began to pulse more rapidly, the figures within it writhing with increased agitation. I could feel pressure building in my ears, in my skull, in my chest, as if the air itself was becoming dense enough to crush me. Uncle Robert's journal had mentioned a doorway, not a physical entrance to a cave, but a portal between worlds. These entities needed human vessels to cross over completely. My uncle had surrendered himself willingly, and now they wanted me. The flare sputtered, the light beginning to fail. In its dying crimson glow, I saw more of the cave floor. Scattered backpacks, cameras, watches frozen at different times, all at odds with the organic horror of the walls. Other hikers, other curious explorers who had vanished without trace over the years. With the last of the flare's light, I saw symbols carved into the cave floor, the same one the branches had formed outside, repeated in an intricate pattern that spiraled toward a central depression in the ground. A depression shaped exactly like a human body lying spread eagle. The flare went out. In the returned darkness, I felt something wet and sinuous wrap around my ankle. The whispering became a roar of triumph. This was it. This was how I would join my uncle and the others, absorbed into the membrane, transformed into something no longer human, a stepping stone for ancient horrors to re-enter the world. But as the tendril tightened, pulling me toward the center of the chamber, something unexpected happened. My terror crystallized not into surrender but into rage. Rage at being manipulated, at being hunted, at being selected as a sacrifice for entities that had no right to exist in our world. I remembered the lighter in my pocket, a habit from my former smoking days. One quick movement and I had it in my hand, thumb striking the wheel. The small flame seemed pathetically inadequate, but it was enough to see the tendril wrapped around my leg, and enough to lower toward it. The effect was instantaneous and shocking. The tendril recoiled violently, a high-pitched keening sound replacing the whispers. The flame seemed to grow brighter, stronger, as if feeding on the darkness itself. I swept it in an arc before me, and the shadows retreated, the pressure in my head subsiding marginally. These things, whatever they were, feared fire. It was knowledge, a weapon. I backed toward where I thought the entrance might be, keeping the lighter flame extended before me like a pitiful torch. The membrane on the walls pulsed erratically now, the figures within it twisting in what might have been pain or rage. My back hit open air. I'd found the entrance. The whispering became desperate, promising riches, knowledge, power, immortality, anything to make me stay, to lower my flame, to give myself willingly as my uncle had done. I backed out under the strange symbol made of fallen branches, the lighter still held before me. The cold receded slightly, though the unnatural silence remained. I could run now, flee back to the marked trail and civilization beyond, but something told me these entities wouldn't simply let me go, wouldn't risk my revealing their presence. My eyes fell on the dry branches arranged in their occult pattern. Without giving myself time to reconsider, I touched the lighter to the nearest one. The wood caught surprisingly quickly, greedily even, the flame spreading to create a blazing barrier between me and the cave entrance. The keening from within rose to an unbearable pitch. The temperature around the cave entrance plummeted further, frost forming instantly on the rocks and trees. But the fire burned hotter in response, as if two fundamental forces were locked in combat. Ancient cold versus cleansing flame. I backed away, watching as the fire spread from branch to branch, the symbol now outlined in crackling orange and gold. Within the cave mouth, shadows writhed and contorted. I thought I glimpsed my uncle's face among them, his expression one of mingled agony and relief. Then came a sound like the earth itself splitting open, a furious, thwarted howl that contained the voices of everything trapped within that membrane. The cave entrance shuddered, cracks appearing in the unnaturally smooth stone arch. Rocks began to fall, then larger boulders, the entire hillside collapsing in on itself. I ran then, not looking back until I had reached a distance that felt marginally safe. When I did turn, the cave was gone, buried beneath tons of rock and earth. The fire still burned around the edges of the rockfall, but it was ordinary fire now, consuming ordinary wood. The symbol it had formed was broken. Its power, whatever it might have been, disrupted. My watch suddenly vibrated on my wrist. The screen had come back to life, the time advancing rapidly from 3:33 until it caught up to the actual hour, 6:17 p.m. My phone powered on as well, signal bars appearing one by one. The forest sounds returned in a rush, birdsong, rustling leaves, distant wildlife. I stood there trembling, tears streaming down my face, uncertain whether to feel triumph or terror at what had nearly happened, at what I had discovered existed in our world. The hiker's code demands we leave no trace of our passage through the wilderness, but some traces are necessary warnings. I used my phone to photograph the rockfall and the surrounding area. Then I plugged the coordinates into my GPS app. Tomorrow I would contact the park authorities, tell them about a dangerous rock slide in an unmarked area of the reserve. I would suggest they update their maps, place warning signs. I wouldn't mention whispers or membranes or entities older than humanity. They wouldn't believe me anyway. But as I hiked back toward the main trail and the safety of civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't escaped. Not really. The entity had touched my mind. It knew me now. And somewhere, perhaps beneath other hills and other forests, other caves waited with other membrane-lined chambers. The ancient presence I'd sensed wasn't destroyed, merely thwarted temporarily. My uncle's journal remained there, buried under rock and earth, but its contents were seared into my memory. The research that had led him to that place, the texts he had studied, the connections he had made. I could retrace those steps if I chose to. The whispers, though distant now, still echoed in some deep recess of my mind. The entities had offered knowledge, perhaps enough knowledge to fight them, to ensure they remained imprisoned. Perhaps that had been my uncle's true purpose all along. I reached the main trail as darkness was falling, my flashlight working perfectly now. My compass pointed steadily north. Everything was normal again, except for me. I would never be normal again. And somewhere in the back of my mind, something ancient and patient waited, knowing we would meet again. Story 3. The neon sign flickered in the darkness, casting eerie red and blue shadows across the empty parking lot. Earl's Roadside Diner, open 24 hours, blinked intermittently, like a desperate heartbeat in the vast emptiness of the Nevada desert. I hadn't seen another vehicle for over 90 miles, and the growling in my stomach had grown from a whisper to a roar. This place, appearing suddenly around a bend in the road, seemed like salvation despite its dilapidated appearance. I hadn't planned to stop until the next town, but my body had other ideas. The exhaustion of 16 straight hours on the road clouded my judgment as I pulled my sedan into the drive-through lane. I rolled down my window, the cool night air raising goosebumps on my forearm. The menu board glowed with an unnatural brightness, its offerings displayed in faded photographs that somehow looked both appetizing and nauseating simultaneously. I leaned out toward the speaker, squinting at the prices that seemed decades out of date. "Welcome to Earl's. May I take your order?" The voice crackled through the intercom with surprising clarity. A woman's voice, pleasant, maybe even cheerful. It contrasted sharply with the desolate surroundings. I ordered a cheeseburger combo, my voice raspy from hours of disuse. The woman confirmed my selection with practiced efficiency, telling me to pull around to the window. I noticed how odd it was that she didn't tell me the total. The normalcy of her voice provided a strange comfort as I navigated around the building. The first indication that something was wrong came when I approached the pickup window. The lights inside the restaurant were on, illuminating empty counters and vacant booths. I could see straight through to the kitchen, where not a single employee moved about. My pulse quickened as I pulled up to the window, expecting to see the woman who had taken my order. Instead, I faced an empty space. The window was partially open, a slight breeze causing the faded yellow curtain behind it to dance gently. I waited, tapping my fingers nervously on the steering wheel, attempting to rationalize the situation. Perhaps she had stepped away momentarily. After 5 minutes of silence, I honked lightly. Nothing, My stomach tightened with a sensation that had nothing to do with hunger. Eventually, I turned off the engine and stepped out of the car. The silence of the desert pressed against my ears as I approached the main entrance. Through the glass door, I could see the same emptiness I'd observed from the drive-through window. No customers, no staff, just vacant tables and the soft hum of fluorescent lights. I pulled the door open, a bell chiming cheerfully above me, the sound jarringly out of place. "Hello?" My voice seemed to fall flat in the stale air. No response. I stepped inside, drawn by curiosity and hunger that overpowered my growing unease. The door swung shut behind me with an unexpectedly heavy thud. I turned back, my heart rate accelerating when I heard the distinct click of a lock engaging. I yanked at the handle. It wouldn't budge. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead as I pulled harder, the door refusing to yield. Panic rose in my throat as I tried the other doors, the emergency exit, the staff entrance, all locked. The windows wouldn't break despite my increasingly desperate attempts. My cell phone showed no service, the screen's glow highlighting my pallid reflection in the darkened glass. I forced myself to breathe slowly, fighting the suffocating tightness in my chest. There had to be a rational explanation. Perhaps this was some elaborate prank. I moved toward the kitchen, calling out again, my voice echoing back to me from the empty dining area. The kitchen door swung open at my touch, revealing stainless steel counters gleaming under harsh lights. The industrial refrigerator hummed softly. Everything was immaculate, as if prepared for a health inspection, or as if no one had cooked here for years. The contradiction made my skin crawl. A soft sizzling sound made me freeze. On the grill, a hamburger patty had appeared, cooking itself as fat dripped and sputtered. My mouth went dry as I watched cheese melt atop the meat, though no visible hand had placed it there. Beside the grill, a knife moved of its own accord, slicing tomatoes with mechanical precision. A bun split itself in half and floated onto a plate. My legs trembled as I backed away from the impossible scene, my spine colliding with the wall. The soda machine behind the counter sprang to life, ice tumbling into a cup before it was filled with dark liquid. French fries rose from a bubbling fryer, excess oil shaking off before they settled into a red cardboard container. I fled from the kitchen, my breath coming in short, painful gasps, my heart hammering against my ribs with such force I feared it might crack them. The dining area no longer looked empty to me. I sensed presences, like heat shimmer on asphalt, occupying the booths and tables. The air felt thicker, charged with invisible energy that pressed against my skin. The bathroom door caught my eye, a potential escape, or at least a place to hide and collect myself. I rushed inside, locking the door behind me and bracing my weight against it. The fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting strange shadows across the checkered floor tiles. My reflection in the mirror showed a man I barely recognized, pale, sweating, eyes wide with terror. But I wasn't alone in the reflection. Behind me, where the empty bathroom should have been, I saw a bustling diner. Men in dated uniforms with greased-back hair wiped counters, while women in poodle skirts and high ponytails delivered plates to tables filled with customers in clothes from another era. They moved with unnatural, jerky motions, like figures in an old film played at the wrong speed. Their faces bore pleasant smiles that never reached their eyes that were uniformly dark and empty, like holes punched into photographs. I spun around, facing nothing but the empty bathroom stalls. When I turned back to the mirror, the scene remained, playing out like a movie projected onto glass. One waitress looked directly at me, her head tilting at an impossible angle, jaw unhinging slightly as her smile widened beyond human capacity. She approached the mirror, tray in hand, as if preparing to step through it. My knees buckled. I scrambled away from the mirror, back pressing against the cold tile wall. The lights flickered more intensely, and in the momentary darkness, I felt fingers brush against my shoulder. The touch was ice cold and left a burning sensation on my skin through my shirt. I fumbled for the door handle, no longer caring what waited for me outside as long as I could escape this bathroom. The lock disengaged with a click that sounded supernaturally loud in the confined space. I practically fell into the dining area, catching myself on a table. The diner had transformed. Where before there had been emptiness, now shadows sat in booths and at tables. Not quite visible, but undeniably present. Dark silhouettes that shifted and wavered like smoke, but maintained human forms. They made no sound, yet I sensed conversations happening, laughter being exchanged, food being consumed. The jukebox in the corner illuminated, though it played no music I could hear. I moved through the ghostly patrons, my body growing colder with each step. The shadow customers didn't acknowledge me, but I felt their awareness, like insects crawling across my skin. My vision blurred at the edges, dark spots dancing before my eyes as hyperventilation threatened to overwhelm me. The sound of sizzling grew louder, and I smelled my order being completed. The burger, the fries, all cooking themselves in the kitchen. A tray floated out through the swinging door, my meal arranged perfectly upon it. It hovered at counter height, waiting. My name tag was on the receipt, my name tag that I wasn't wearing. My full name, my address back in California, my license plate number. The information stared up at me from the white slip of paper, the ink still fresh. Below it, handwritten in flowing script, "We've been waiting for you." The words sent electric fear shooting down my spine. My legs moved before my mind could process what was happening, carrying me toward the kitchen, seeking any possible exit. I crashed through the swinging door, nearly slipping on the polished floor. The cooking utensils continued their dance, preparing meals for customers who had died decades ago. At the back of the kitchen, a door I hadn't noticed before stood slightly ajar. Through it I could see darkness, not the warm darkness of night, but an absolute void. Something in my mind screamed to stay away, but my options had dwindled to nothing. As I approached the door, the activity in the kitchen intensified. Pots clattered, ovens opened and closed, temperatures rose until sweat poured down my face. The invisible staff seemed agitated by my movement toward the mysterious exit. A knife flew from its position, embedding itself in the wall inches from my head. I ducked, heart nearly stopping, before lunging for the door. The moment my hand touched the handle, all activity ceased. Silence descended, so complete I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. The temperature plummeted, my breath fogged before me. In that silence, I heard the woman's voice again, the same one from the drive-through speaker. "Your order isn't ready yet," she said, her voice coming from everywhere and nowhere. "No one leaves before they're served." I yanked the door open and hurled myself through it before her last word faded. Instead of an exit, I found myself in a narrow hallway, dimly lit by bulbs that swung gently without any breeze. Photographs lined the walls, hundreds of them, showing the diner throughout the years. In each image, the staff posed with customers, all smiling those two wide smiles. As I moved down the corridor, the photos became older, the clothing and cars changing to reflect passing decades. What horrified me wasn't the progression of time, but the faces. In the newest photos, near the entrance to the hallway, distinct individuals smiled back at the camera. But as I moved deeper, examining older photos, the same faces appeared repeatedly. Staff members who should have aged or died remained identical across 50 years of images, and certain customers reappeared too, including one who bore my exact face, standing in front of the diner in a photograph dated 1954. My doppelganger wore different clothes, had a different hairstyle, but the face was unmistakably mine. My legs nearly gave out beneath me as I stared at this impossible image. The date was clearly visible on a calendar hanging in the background. Next to my double stood a waitress, her hand resting possessively on his shoulder, her smile stretching too wide across her face. The hallway ended at another door, simple, wooden, unremarkable. I grasped the handle, no longer certain I wanted to discover what lay beyond, but knowing I couldn't return the way I came. The metal was ice cold against my palm as I turned it. The door opened onto the parking lot where my car waited, exactly as I had left it. Dawn was breaking over the desert, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. I stumbled toward my vehicle, keys clutched so tightly in my hand that they left indentations in my palm. As I reached for the car door, a reflection in the window caused me to freeze. The diner behind me wasn't the run-down establishment I'd entered. It was pristine, new-looking, with a full parking lot and customers visible through the windows. The sign read, "Earl's Roadside Diner, grand opening today." I turned slowly, preparing myself for whatever impossible sight awaited me. But there was nothing there, just an empty concrete foundation, overgrown with desert weeds, the remnants of a building long demolished. A faded sign lay half buried in the sand. "Coming soon, Earl's Roadside Diner." The construction had been abandoned decades ago. I drove away with the taste of a hamburger in my mouth that I had never eaten, the receipt with my name still clutched in my trembling hand, and the certainty that somewhere in that place between what was and what might have been, invisible hands were still preparing orders for customers who would never leave. Sometimes I still hear the drive-through speaker crackle to life in my dreams. "Welcome to Earl's. May I take your order?" And in my reflection in the rearview mirror just for a moment, I see that waitress from the photograph, standing in my back seat, her hand reaching for my shoulder, her smile stretching wider than any human mouth should go. I never stopped driving anymore. Story 4. The wind howled through the narrow gorge like a wounded animal, its echo bouncing off sheer stone walls and slicing through the thin mountain air. My breath turned to white mist in front of me, a subtle reminder that even in the daylight, this place had its own brand of chill. Each gust felt like invisible claws scraping across my jacket, prying at the edges of my courage. Before I even secured my first handhold on the rock, I felt something was off, something old, something waiting. And though I tried to dismiss it as just another subtle warning from nature, an undercurrent of dread settled in my gut, determined not to let go. I was standing at the base of the cliff, looking up at a route known among local climbers as the Spectre's Spine. It was one of those legendary ascents that seem to attract only the bold or the foolish. A friend once told me that the name came from a rumor about a ghostly figure spotted on these heights long ago. He had recounted how a climber vanished without a trace here decades past, leaving nothing behind except a battered car at the trailhead and a rope frayed at one end. I had laughed it off at the time, chalking it up to the tall tales that always swirl around extreme climbs. Yet now, facing the towering wall of stone, my laughter seemed painfully distant. The creeping sense of unease dug into my thoughts, twisting and burrowing deeper with each passing moment. My decision to climb alone had been part necessity, part arrogance. Scheduling conflicts with other climbers, an upcoming storm front, and my own stubborn drive to test my limits all led me here, roped in and alone. Solo ascents carry risk under any conditions, but this route was especially perilous. The rock face was known for its brittle sections and unexpected overhangs. Each rung on my harness was loaded with cams, quick draws, and carabiners. Yet even the best gear isn't foolproof when nature decides to show its teeth. The first 20 meters went smoothly enough. My adrenaline sharpened my focus, making every foothold and finger jam feel precise. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, and my breaths were deep yet controlled. Occasionally, small pebbles dislodged from beneath my grip, tinkling down the rock until they vanished into the emptiness below. That hollow clatter sent a spike of fear through my chest each time. I was trying to focus, to keep my mind from wandering to the rumors and the sense of being watched that now pulsed at the edges of my awareness. At around 30 meters, the environment seemed to shift subtly. The wind's pitch changed, morphing into what I could have sworn were faint shrieks carried on the gusts. Each time I paused to listen, the sound would fade. My mouth was dry, my palms damp. Squeezing chalk from my bag, I tried to calm the tremor in my fingers. The temperature dropped so rapidly at one point that I shivered in my thermal layers. Every muscle in my back tensed as though someone or something was studying me from an impossible vantage point. I pressed on, ascending another 10 meters, wrestling with my own mounting paranoia. The rope at my waist felt heavier, my harness digging into my hips like a vice. Each exhale was a ragged whisper, and I noticed a film of sweat gathering under my helmet strap, trickling slowly down my brow. The sense of dread became a dull roar in my head, a persistent voice telling me that I shouldn't be here, that I was trespassing in a place that didn't belong to the living. Still, I pushed the thoughts aside. I'd come too far to back down now. By the time I was at 60 meters, that voice in my head had grown louder, relentlessly gnawing at my composure. My heartbeat thrummed in my throat, threatening to choke off my air. My arms burned from the strain, and my legs felt shaky from a mixture of fatigue and pure dread. Suddenly, my left foot slipped on a loose hold. My entire body jolted, the weight of gravity pulling me violently backward. In a heartbeat, I thought my rope would catch me, or worse, that I'd plummet into empty space. I started to fall, muscles tensed, heart roaring, stomach lurching in what felt like the final instant of control. But before the rope even went taut, I felt a cold, unmistakably solid pressure on my back. It felt like a human hand. Strong fingers splayed just below my shoulder blades, stabilizing me. The shock of it sent a jolt through my body, as if every nerve ending fired at once. Gasping, I managed to regain my footing and latch onto a nearby protrusion. My arms shook, and a stuttering breath escaped me. I twisted my head around, more out of reflex than conscious decision, and caught a flicker of movement, a translucent shape at the corner of my vision. For just a heartbeat, I swore I saw a man's face, etched with grim determination, wearing old-fashioned climbing gear. His eyes held mine for what felt like an eternity, brimming with something between warning and desperation. Then he vanished, dissolving into the air like vapor caught in the sunlight. My pulse hammered, and my hands shook so violently that I feared I might lose my grip again. An icy sweat oozed from my pores, soaking through my layers. There was no rational explanation for what had just happened, and the shock of it hit me full force. Time seemed to stop. I desperately clung to the stone, my breath ragged. The wind picked up, slicing across my exposed cheeks. The clang of my carabiners rattling in the breeze seemed absurdly loud. Instinct screamed at me to get off this cursed cliff, but a part of me, prideful, disbelieving, or maybe just stubborn, refused to descend. I had to understand what just happened, had to see if my mind was playing tricks on me or if something truly unimaginable had occurred. Pushing upward, I forced my limbs to move one hold at a time. My senses were in overdrive. Every crunch of gravel beneath my climbing shoes made me flinch. I kept imagining I'd see that shape again, some specter drifting along the rock face. My body was bathed in adrenaline, and I found my breathing had become shallow and rapid. The intense awareness that I was utterly alone out here, with no one to verify or deny my experiences, gnawed at the edges of my sanity. Then the screaming started in earnest. At first, it was a faint wail so distant that I thought it was the wind. But it rose in clarity, repeating like a dreadful refrain. It sounded like pleas for help, anguished, echoing through the valley beneath me. I froze, pressing myself against the cold stone. My mind scrambled to piece together a rational explanation. Perhaps other climbers were out of sight. Maybe someone else was scaling a different face and got into trouble. But the valley's vantage was clear from my precarious perch. There was no movement, no other human figure, no sign of a rope or gear. Just the vast, yawning chasm below me, and those relentless cries for help that pierced my skull. In a moment of desperate logic, I tried to recall the stories about the climber who disappeared here. I remembered hearing that search parties had scoured the mountain for weeks, drawn by the haunting calls that never led them to a body, only to more confusion and heartbreak. Some older climbers recounted how they, too, had heard inexplicable screams echoing at odd hours, always in the same tone, always in the same pattern. They said it was a trap, a lure cast by the restless spirit to draw the living into the same fate. But fate was not a subject I wanted to dwell on. My body trembled with both the biting cold and the sensation of being lured by something I couldn't understand. As I climbed higher, each breath felt like shards of ice cutting into my lungs. My legs wobbled with fatigue, and a throbbing ache spread through my shoulders. Sweat dripped into my eyes, stinging and blurring my vision. Still, those cries echoed, sometimes near, sometimes far. They seemed to chase me, or perhaps precede me, as though guiding me along the route I was taking. My own thoughts became my enemy. I questioned if I was hallucinating from altitude or if something more sinister was at play. Even as my rational mind insisted that ghosts didn't exist, my churning gut and hammering heart insisted otherwise. I lost track of how long I clung to the wall like that, half crazed with fear. A creeping paranoia took hold. Every rustle of wind, every crack in the rock became a sign of hidden watchers. The possibility that I was crossing into some spiritual domain nagged at me. My skin felt clammy beneath my clothes, even as the temperature plummeted further. When I paused to catch my breath, the hairs on the back of my neck rose. The instinctive reaction of prey sensing a predator. I had the unmistakable feeling I was being observed. I found myself whispering half-formed pleas under my breath, telling whatever lurked just beyond my sight that I meant no harm, that I only wanted to climb, to get through this unscathed. Eventually, I reached a small ledge, a narrow shelf about half a meter wide. I sagged onto it, pressing my forehead against the cold stone. My breathing was ragged, and the trembling in my arms had grown worse. My mind kept circling back to that phantom hand that saved me. The memory of it triggered fresh goosebumps along my arms. It was so real, so deliberate. I felt an uneasy mixture of gratitude and revulsion. Gratitude because I was still alive. Revulsion because I could not separate that survival from something I couldn't define as living. As I tried to steady myself, I sensed a flicker of movement to my right. Jerking my head up, I saw nothing. The ledge behind me was empty. Nevertheless, I felt the presence again, that almost palpable awareness that accompanied me since the slip. My eyes darted across the cliff face, searching for any tangible sign of life or unlife, but there was only the gray rock and the howling wind. I swallowed hard, mouth too dry to muster spit. A nauseating wave of dizziness washed over me. My instincts demanded I descend, but to do so from this height carried its own dangers. The memory of that ghostly figure loomed large in my mind, as though it might appear again at any moment, maybe to save me, or maybe to push me over the edge. I forced myself to continue, finding strength in the mechanical repetition of climbing. Hand, foot, hand, foot. Each movement became an act of will, overshadowing the chaos in my head. The terrified scream from below echoed periodically, as if reminding me that I was never truly alone. My arms burned like molten lead, each grip feeling weaker. As I neared a tricky overhang, a swirl of cold air blasted my face, carrying with it that faint moan, a call that trailed off into a whimper. Something in me snapped. I couldn't contain my horror any longer. I let out a scream of my own, raw, primal. It ripped from my throat without form or thought, mingling with the mountain's mournful chorus. For a moment, there was silence, as if the valley itself paused to listen. My vision blurred, heart hammering so loudly I thought it would crack my ribs. I half expected the echoes of my shout to return in the voice of another, twisted and malevolent. But only the wind answered, tossing bits of gravel that pinged off my helmet. With the last reserves of my strength, I scrambled over the overhang. Every muscle in my body strained, and I could feel my lips trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and raw terror. When I finally hauled myself onto a wider shelf, the magnitude of it sank in. I was alive, and in that instant, the screaming stopped. A hush descended on the mountainside, broken only by the rustle of wind. Part of me feared I had gone deaf or that the entire world had ground to a halt. My throat felt like sandpaper, and my lungs were on fire. Still no more screaming, no more howling pleas for help. My relief was tinged with dread, as if the mountain was planning its next move. For several excruciating minutes, I let myself rest. My muscles quivered, and the throbbing in my head intensified. Then, a whisper, it might have been my own mind or maybe something else, slid into my thoughts. Don't linger. My breath caught in my chest. I rummaged for water, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the bottle. The water felt like liquid ice as I gulped it down, but it did little to calm the panic thrashing inside me. I started my final ascent, eyes stinging from sweat and tears I hadn't realized were there. At any moment, I expected to feel that frigid hand again on my back, or see that spectral figure looming in my peripheral vision. The tension in my spine wound tighter with each meter gained. Every nerve in my body was on high alert, scanning for the slightest sign of the supernatural. I was half convinced that the ghost wanted to drag me away, to become another vanished climber whose only legacy would be the faint echo of unanswered screams. Yet the final stretch of rock passed in eerie silence. I pulled myself over the top, rolling onto the rocky plateau. My arms were so exhausted I could barely stand, and my vision pulsed with black spots. The wind battered me, but it felt less oppressive than before. For a moment I just lay there, chest heaving, trying to grasp the reality of what had happened. No triumphant sense of achievement warmed my veins. Instead, a cold knot of confusion and dread lodged in my gut. The temperature still felt unnaturally low at the summit, but the wind's howl had lost that unnerving, human-like quality. Cautiously, I rose to my feet. The horizon stretched out in a breathtaking panorama, a tapestry of peaks and valleys bathed in the waning afternoon sun. Such beauty normally would have captivated me, but all I felt was a profound sense of violation, as if the mountain itself had tried to claim me. For a brief moment, I closed my eyes. My heart still pounded, but the adrenaline rush was giving way to overwhelming fatigue. I could almost sense the presence behind me again. When I turned around, I saw only my own footprints in the gravel near the cliff's edge. A wave of vertigo rolled over me as I recalled how close I'd come to falling. The memory of that firm hand on my back, so real, made my skin crawl. I wondered if the spirit of that lost climber had acted out of compassion, or if it was something else, using me for reasons I couldn't fathom. I made my way down a safer trail on the far side of the peak, each step a cautious negotiation with gravity. My mind was a jumbled mess, replaying the terrifying slip, the ghostly apparition, the screams that seemed to cry out from another realm. As I descended, the wind carried faint whispers that made me glance over my shoulder more than once. Every twig snapping or rock shifting felt like an omen. I half expected to see someone staring at me from behind a boulder, but the path was deserted, and that somehow felt worse. By the time I reached the base of the mountain, the last traces of daylight were clinging to the horizon. My legs threatened to collapse beneath me, but I pushed on, determined to put as much distance between myself and that haunted cliff as possible. In the dim twilight, my car was a welcome sight, my only anchor to the mundane reality I desperately wanted to return to. Even as I drove away, I couldn't escape the suffocating sense that I was being followed. My hands were clammy on the steering wheel, muscles rigid with tension. The reflection in my rearview mirror played tricks on me, forging flickers of motion in the empty back seat. The memory of the translucent climber was etched into my mind, as if seared by a hot iron. A part of me wanted to believe that I had been saved by a benevolent force, but the rest of me couldn't shake the suspicion that I had crossed paths with something unnatural that left a mark on me, a bond formed in terror that could never fully be undone. I came away from that climb physically unharmed, but forever changed. I didn't talk much about it afterward. Whenever people asked about the specter's spine, I would simply shake my head and mutter something vague about bad conditions. In quiet moments, though, I heard distant echoes of those screams in the back of my mind. An inexplicable chill would settle into my bones, as though reminding me that some doors, once opened, remain ajar, and that whatever lurked behind them might still be watching. Even now, recalling the incident makes my stomach knot and my heart race. I can't forget the feel of that supernatural grip, or the desperate face that flickered just within sight. I managed to escape the mountain's grasp, yet I'm not certain I truly left it behind. Whenever the wind picks up at night and moans through the cracks in my windows, my mind drifts to that towering cliff. I can almost taste the fear on my tongue again, as real and bitter as the chalk dust I used to steady my hands. And I realize, with a chilling certainty, that some part of me remains on that ledge, still clinging to the stone, caught between the living world and whatever lurks just beyond our reach. Story 5. A thin veil of light from the distant street lamps barely reached the mall's sprawling parking lot, casting long shadows across the asphalt and lending each parked car a warped silhouette. The echo of my own footsteps seemed unnervingly amplified, as though something unseen were stalking in rhythm with my every move. I remember thinking that the emptiness felt unnatural, like walking through a stage set after all the actors had gone home. Yet there I was, heading to my car under that oppressive silence, never suspecting how quickly a mundane moment could twist into the most agonizing nightmare of my life. I had just finished a late meeting in a nearby cafe and decided to take a shortcut through the mall's parking structure. At that hour, the shoppers had mostly gone, and a few employees were straggling out to their cars, but it was hardly the bustling place it had been earlier in the day. My plan was simple: retrieve my car, drive home, and collapse into bed. But even as I entered the lower levels of the parking area, a chill prickled the back of my neck. The fluorescent lamps flickered erratically, creating a strobe-like effect along the concrete pillars. Each flicker seemed to reveal shapes in the corners, perhaps illusions or pockets of shadow, but enough to raise goosebumps on my arms. I reminded myself that such structures always felt eerie when empty. The faint hum of electricity, the faint chemical odor of oil and rubber, the claustrophobic echoes. They could all conspire to create paranoia. Yet something else gnawed at me. A subtle sense that I was intruding somewhere forbidden. The further I walked, the heavier the atmosphere became, as though the air itself resisted my progress. Then I saw him. A man in a security guard's uniform stepped out from behind a concrete column, his hand raised in a motion to halt me. I felt my heart hammer uncomfortably in my chest. Something about his stance gave me pause. He was too still, too poised. He claimed, in a flat, quiet tone, that he was private security for the mall and needed to see my ID. I could see a streak of dark substance on his sleeve, but I tried to brush it off as grease or paint. My throat went dry, and I asked him to show me his credentials instead. He reached for his pocket, but instead of producing a badge, his face twisted into something indescribable. The muscles in his cheeks seemed to pull away from the bone, revealing elongated teeth. His skin turned a sickly, translucent pallor, like old wax. Dried, rust-colored stains marred his uniform, as if he had been dragged through some vile substance and left to rot. My heart convulsed in my chest, and I felt my breath catch. Adrenaline spiked through me as I stumbled backward. A sour taste spread in my mouth, the tang of fear so sharp it was almost metallic. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing, some sort of costume, a trick of the flickering lights. But the image refused to make logical sense. Every nerve in my body screamed to run. And so I did. I spun around and sprinted toward where I believed the exit should be. My legs felt heavy, each step landing with a jolt that reverberated through my spine. The overhead lights buzzed and sputtered, forming pools of dim illumination amid stretches of near darkness. My lungs burned. My pulse pounded like a desperate drum. All I wanted was to find the stairwell that led back to the main level, or an elevator I could ride up to the mall entrance. Instead, the rows of cars seemed to multiply, twisting the pathways into a senseless maze. The more I ran, the more disoriented I became. Every corner led me to another identical section of parked vehicles, the same battered columns, the same flickering lights. My footsteps splashed through small puddles of water, or something else, that had collected near drains, the sound echoing hollowly. At one point, I thought I recognized my own car, but as I hurried toward it, the shape seemed to warp and shift under the uneven light, revealing a different make and model altogether. Anxiety churned in my stomach, and I realized that nothing about this place felt real anymore. I heard a scuff of movement behind me and whipped my head around. There he stood again, that same security guard, though how he could have outpaced me was impossible to comprehend. My temples throbbed, and sweat dripped into my eyes. He simply stared with those deep, sunken sockets, black pupils reflecting the flicker of the overhead lamps. My throat closed up as I fought to steady my breathing. Then I tried a different direction, stumbling past a row of silent cars. At first, I believed I could hear him following, but when I risked another glance, he wasn't there. Relief was short-lived, though, because a few steps later, I spotted him again, half shrouded in a dim corridor near a ramp leading to an upper level. My knees nearly gave out. It was as if he could appear wherever he wished, simultaneously in multiple places at once. A nauseating wave of dread washed over me. I wondered if I was going insane, if the flickering lights and oppressive stillness were driving me toward some hallucinatory breakdown. I tried to rationalize. Perhaps there were multiple guards wearing the same uniform. Perhaps it was a bizarre coincidence, or my panicked mind was conjuring illusions. But each time I locked eyes with him, I felt a suffocating chill, as though something cold and grasping reached into my core. That sensation was too visceral to dismiss. I felt the hair on my arms stand on end, and my heartbeat refused to slow. At some point, I found a fire escape door. The sign above it flickered half-lit. My legs trembled so badly I nearly collapsed against the cold metal. It took both hands to yank it open. The door led into a stairwell, but as soon as I crossed the threshold, a pungent odor flooded my nostrils, a mix of mildew and something metallic that turned my stomach. I gagged, struggling not to retch. The walls were tinted an unsettling shade of greenish gray, and the only lighting came from a flickering emergency lamp that cast everything in a jaundiced hue. I stumbled down the steps, trying to keep one hand on the railing for balance. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my shirt clung to my back, drenched in sweat. Each footstep echoed too loudly, as though the stairwell were an empty well that swallowed and distorted every sound. Despite the nauseating smell, I kept going, convinced that any exit away from that monstrous guard was better than wandering the parking labyrinth. I reached what I thought might be the ground level, but when I shoved the door open, I found myself in yet another section of the parking lot. It stretched into darkness in both directions, far larger than I remembered the mall's structure to be. My muscles tensed, and a fresh wave of panic threatened to buckle my knees. There was no sign of an exterior exit, no glimpses of the streetlights or store signs I had seen earlier. It was like the entire geometry of the building had changed around me. I spotted a sign posted on one of the columns, a directory arrow pointing to different levels, but the directions made no sense. The floors were labeled with strange symbols, some letters missing or scrambled. My breath hitched, and I pressed my palm against the concrete, feeling its rough chill. I tried to steady myself, to focus on anything that felt real. My heart beat so loudly I felt it in my eardrums. It was then that I heard a faint scraping of a boot on the concrete floor behind me. I refused to turn around right away, too scared to confront whatever horror stood there. A rush of cold sweat trickled down my spine. When I finally mustered the courage to glance over my shoulder, I saw a shape shift in the darkness. That face emerged once more, twisted and pale, teeth too long, eyes sunken. The dried stains on the uniform seemed to glisten in the flicker of overhead lamps, as if some dreadful fluid seeped back to the surface. I let out a strangled gasp. He made a low, guttural sound that I can only describe as a mockery of laughter. I clenched my jaw and sprinted away again, half blinded by tears of terror. My lungs felt on fire, my throat raw. No matter how far I ran, no matter how many corners I turned, the place never opened up. Doors led to hallways that opened into more sections of the parking lot, each one laid out in a subtly wrong configuration. The oppressive silence amplified every ragged breath, every frenzied heartbeat. I could swear I heard footsteps echoing my own, but every time I listened more carefully, those steps vanished into the hush. My mind ricocheted between rational thought and raw panic. One moment, I thought that maybe I should check my phone for a signal, but then realized with a jolt of despair that I had left it in my car's glove compartment earlier. The next moment, I considered banging on car doors, hoping to set off an alarm that might break this spell, but I felt certain that any noise might draw him closer. I slowed my pace eventually, exhausted and dizzy. The air felt heavy with some kind of intangible weight. My eyes prickled with unshed tears. I rubbed them with the back of my hand, half expecting to awaken from a delusion. Yet the stale smell of exhaust and dust grounded me in a reality I couldn't escape. My muscles quivered, and my lips tasted of salt and fear. Then I noticed something new. Faint footprints on the dusty concrete. footprints that I recognized as my own, leading in a circle. The realization that I had been running in loops tore a desperate moan from my throat. I questioned if I was losing my mind entirely. The corners, pillars, and rows of cars all seemed too similar, as if the environment was repeating itself like a broken record. Bile rose in my throat, and for a moment, I doubled over, coughing dryly. In that moment of weakness, I felt a presence behind me again, the sensation of eyes drilling into the back of my skull. My skin prickled, and a cold flush washed over me. Without turning around, I sensed him looming there, impossibly close. The urge to flee battled with the suspicion that running was futile. My breath came in ragged bursts, short and shallow, and my heart threatened to burst from my chest. Summoning every shred of courage, I spun around, bracing for an attack. He stood a few feet away, his posture unnaturally rigid, the corners of his mouth curving into a chilling grin. I clenched my fists, though I had no plan. I heard my own voice cracking as I demanded to know what he wanted, but it sounded small and lost in the cavernous darkness. I recalled someone once mentioning that sometimes facing a nightmare head-on could break its hold. Though my entire being screamed to keep running, I forced my shaking legs to stand their ground. My mouth was so dry my tongue felt numb, and every muscle in my body tensed with the expectation of violence. My vision blurred momentarily, then refocused on that leering figure. The security guard's face flickered like a glitching image, as though it existed on multiple planes at once. My head pounded. I was certain I was on the brink of losing consciousness. Then, with a sudden sputtering surge, the overhead lights blinked off entirely. For a second, the world was plunged into total blackness. My heart seized in my chest, adrenaline surging anew. I forced myself to stay put, to wait, to see if this was the end or some further torment. When the lights finally hummed back to life, dim and erratic, they revealed that I stood alone. There was no trace of him, no echo of footsteps, no monstrous visage glaring at me. The quiet was so absolute it felt like a vacuum, and all I could hear was my own hammering pulse. It took a few moments to realize that the exit ramp to the street level was now visible, illuminated as if a single bright lamp had activated just for that passage. My instincts warned me it could be a trap, but I had nowhere else to go. I crept toward it, each step weighted with dread, expecting at any second that the guard would lunge from the darkness. The tension in my shoulders coiled tighter with every inch of progress, and a low ringing in my ears added to the unreality of the situation. Yet no one stopped me. I reached the ramp and found a narrow path leading up toward an open security gate. Beyond it, I could see the faint glow of a public street lamp. I stumbled forward, half in disbelief, half in relief. My legs felt like lead, but the hope of escape was enough to propel me. I emerged onto the street, not quite sure if what I saw was truly the familiar road or another illusion. A wave of nighttime air hit me, warmer than the stale chill inside the parking structure, and I sucked it in greedily. For several seconds, I just stood on the sidewalk, my chest heaving, sweat dripping down my temples. I glanced back only once. The interior of the parking lot behind the gate was dark again, the flickering lights extinguished. The strangest part was that, from the outside, the structure looked just like any ordinary parking facility. Nothing betrayed the surreal labyrinth I had just navigated. My mind spun with questions, disbelief, and an undercurrent of lingering terror. I felt as though a veil had been torn away, revealing a malignant force lurking just beneath the surface of the mundane world. As the adrenaline ebbed, tremors shook my arms and legs, and I sank onto a nearby bench, wiping cold sweat from my brow. I kept expecting to see that distorted face peering at me from around the corner, but all that met my eyes were the distant headlights of the occasional passing car, the hum of late-night traffic, and a few scattered pedestrians hurrying home. No monstrous guard, no labyrinthine corridors. Only the memory haunted me now, etched into my nerves, leaving me jumpy and suspicious of every shadow. To this day, I can't make sense of what happened in that parking lot. I struggle to recall the exact series of turns I made, or how the structure twisted into a maze that violated all logical geometry. There are nights I wake up drenched in sweat, convinced that I've heard a faint scraping of boots in the hallway outside my apartment. My friends see the jitter in my hands when I hold a coffee mug, the restless glances I cast over my shoulder. They ask if I'm okay, and I give them vague reassurances. But deep down, I can't shake the feeling that the entity I encountered in that subterranean sprawl is still out there, waiting. Sometimes I wonder if the entire event was a hallucination born of stress or a waking nightmare caused by exhaustion. Yet I can't deny the clarity of my memories. His waxy pallor, the uniform stained with something dark, the flickering corridors stretching on forever. There was a tangible, horrifying presence in that place, and I'll never see a parking structure in the same way again. Every so often I catch a glimpse of a security guard at a mall or office building. My heart skips a beat, and I feel an urgent need to check their badge, to verify that they're real. Rationally, I know they are. But that creeping sensation at the back of my mind, the whispered fear that the nightmare is not over, refuses to leave me in peace. I escaped that night, though I'm not sure how or why I was allowed to leave. But the mental scars remain, coloring my perception of normalcy, leaving me perpetually braced for the moment the fluorescent lights might flicker and reveal something impossible once again. And that, I think, is what truly terrifies me. The knowledge that behind the ordinary facade of daily life, horror can lurk in the most unexpected places, just waiting for a chance to show its face. Story 6. The air was stale and unmoving, like a tomb sealed for centuries. Even before I opened my eyes that evening, I felt the heaviness pressing down on my chest. Every nerve in my body tingled with anticipation, as though something ancient and unseen was watching me from a dark corner of the room. My heart pounded so loudly, I half expected to hear its echo off the walls. By the time I was fully awake, my mouth was dry, my palms were clammy, and my pulse throbbed in my temples. I sensed that no matter how many lights I turned on, or how many blankets I wrapped myself in, I would never truly feel safe again. My name is Alden, and I'm an engineer working on a large construction project in a coastal region notorious for its unpredictable weather. From the moment I was assigned to the job, a hollow dread took root in my chest. I initially wrote it off as stress over deadlines and environmental concerns. Waves of guilt sometimes washed over me when I imagined the disruption our project might cause to the surrounding landscape. But what I initially dismissed as mere anxiety soon grew into something far more insidious. In the early days, my unease manifested as fleeting moments of discomfort. I would be inspecting blueprints in my cramped office trailer, and a low rumble of thunder outside would make me glance at the windows. I could have sworn the glass shifted, like it was distorting under the pressure of unseen water. Whenever I attempted to bring this up indirectly, a few team members said they occasionally felt strange vibrations, but they never elaborated, and I never pressed. It was easier to ignore the sense of being watched. I told myself it was fatigue, the result of late nights, poring over structural designs and environmental reports. The visions arrived without warning and tore away any semblance of normalcy I had managed to maintain. One morning, I was out at the site, standing on a ridge of packed dirt, looking down at the half-completed foundation. The wind carried the tang of salt from the nearby bay. The sun was just peeking through a layer of gray clouds, and everything felt oddly still. A wave of dizziness hit me, and my vision blurred. In that moment, I saw a rushing torrent of water surge over the incomplete structures, flooding the entire area. The water wasn't normal. It had a strange density, almost glistening in an otherworldly hue. Dark silhouettes moved beneath its surface, humanoid forms shimmering with a watery translucence. They swept across the site, dragging everything and everyone in their path deeper into the flood. I could almost hear the roar of the water and the muted cries of people struggling to breathe. Though the vision ended abruptly, leaving me gasping for air, I tried to explain this terrifying image to my coworkers. My boss gave me a concerned look, but quickly shifted to a more practical tone, noting that we should probably have another hydrological survey completed if I was worried about flooding. It wasn't what I meant, but I couldn't find the words to describe the creatures I'd seen. A few colleagues made polite nods, but seemed to dismiss my sense of panic as overwork. I felt my chest tighten with frustration and dread. That same day, as I was about to repeat my warning in a more urgent tone, I was overtaken by a violent coughing fit. To my horror, the liquid I hacked up tasted of salt and smelled briny. My throat burned as though I had inhaled seawater. I couldn't explain it. I remember reeling from the strangeness, the acrid smell, the sting in my nasal passages, the startled looks on the faces of two coworkers who saw me choking. When I tried to show them the droplets in my hand, they looked like ordinary water. Yet I was certain it was salt water, as though fresh from the ocean. My boss told me to take the rest of the day off. I left, feeling eyes on me the entire drive back to my rented home. I had chosen to stay in a modest house close to the site. It seemed convenient, a short commute, and the landlady had warned me the plumbing could be finicky. I assumed she meant occasional rusty water or a rattling pipe. But after that day on the ridge, the tap water in my bathroom sink started turning murky when I was alone, brownish green like a polluted river. The metallic pipes groaned so loudly I felt my skin prickle. Yet whenever someone else came over, like a coworker who dropped by to discuss drawings, or a neighbor returning a misdelivered package, the water ran completely clear. I felt like I was losing my mind. Night after night, I woke up shivering, drenched in sweat, and sometimes found small clumps of wet algae tangled in my sheets. The disgusting smell lingered on my skin no matter how much I scrubbed. A kind of exhaustion settled over me that I couldn't shake. My muscles ached, and my eyes constantly felt gritty. No matter how many cups of coffee I drank, my head buzzed with half-formed thoughts and swirling paranoia. At times, I was convinced that something was following me. Small noises behind closed doors, faint splashing sounds in the pipes, the drip, drip, drip of water even when every faucet was off. I remember standing in my kitchen late one evening, the overhead light flickering, convinced I heard footsteps sloshing through water just outside my back door. I rushed to open it, heart racing so loudly it drowned out my rational mind. Yet the night was still, the yard covered in damp grass but no signs of footprints. That slow, creeping dread started to consume my every waking hour. My coworkers began to avoid me. Indirectly, I heard them refer to me as the doomsayer, someone who had become fixated on catastrophic floods. One day, I overheard a conversation in which they theorized I was unfit for the project and just needed a break. I felt humiliated, but more than that, I felt utterly alone. My attempts at describing my experiences came out sounding hysterical, so I started keeping them to myself. It didn't help that each time I even thought about raising the issue, my throat constricted, and I coughed up that awful salt water again. I began carrying tissues in my pocket just in case. Back at home, the plumbing horrors intensified. The water from my shower head sometimes came out in thick spurts of blackish-green fluid, leaving slimy residue in the bathtub. No matter how thoroughly I scrubbed, the stains returned by the next day. My reflection in the bathroom mirror seemed off. My eyes looked sunken, the skin under them bruised and dark. Occasionally, I thought I caught a flicker of movement behind me, like an elongated shadow shaped in ripples. But when I spun around, I only saw the crumbling tiles. I also started hearing a low-frequency hum in my house, like a deep thrumming that made my bones vibrate. Some nights, I would wake up to the sensation of being underwater, muffled hearing, pressure on my eardrums, and the taste of salt on my lips. The smell of algae became my constant companion. I left fans running and windows open, but the odor never dispersed. My nightmares grew more frequent. I dreamt of walking into my living room, only to find it submerged in dark water, furniture floating aimlessly while watery humanoid figures beckoned to me with twisting arms. As the days passed, my visits to the construction site grew more fraught. I started seeing water pooling in places it shouldn't, shallow puddles along the edges of unfinished concrete, rivulets leaking from seemingly dry walls. When I pointed out the damp spots, others told me I was imagining things or assured me they would run a quick inspection. Their faces betrayed concern, but not the kind that comes from genuine belief. Rather, the kind you show someone who might be losing touch with reality. I tried to stay rational. I pored over geological surveys, drainage plans, anything that could explain what I was experiencing. But nothing made sense. No official data indicated an increased risk of flooding, nor did we have any reason to believe the local waterways were contaminated in the bizarre manner I was witnessing. The more I delved into the paperwork, the more I felt like I was looking for a ghost in the margins. Each page turned into a sea of meaningless text that didn't hold the answers I sought. The tension escalated one late afternoon. I was alone at the site, double-checking measurements before a batch of concrete was set to be poured the next day. The wind whipped through metal scaffolding, producing a hollow clang that reverberated in my chest. My breath caught in my throat as the sky darkened prematurely, thick clouds rolling in from the horizon like a mass of stormy ink. The air tasted metallic, and my stomach knotted with dread. Suddenly I heard a noise like rushing water behind me. I spun around and found that a large section of the pit we had dug looked submerged, but there was no actual rain falling yet, just the promise of a storm. My heart hammered as I climbed down to inspect. The ground seemed wet, but not saturated enough to cause an instant flood. I moved closer, each step accompanied by a squishing sound. Then I saw something that made my stomach lurch. Faint outlines, shapes in the murky reflection. They looked like human figures made entirely of water, features blurred and shifting, arms reaching upward as if beckoning from beneath the surface. I stumbled backward, nearly losing my footing. For a moment, I was gripped by terror so profound it felt like my lungs refused to work. My mouth tasted of salt again, and I feared another choking episode would follow. I forced myself to breathe slowly, in through my nose and out through my mouth, trying to regain control. The visions flickered, like they were simultaneously there and not there. My mind rebelled, telling me it was an optical illusion, a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew that what I saw was neither reflection nor hallucination. I backed away, my boots caked in wet dirt. I could feel the presence of those watery beings, an oppressive weight that pressed on my chest. They seemed to watch me, faceless yet filled with a cold intelligence. The wind picked up, and a sheet of rain finally poured down, forcing me to run back to my truck. Even as I slammed the door shut and turned the ignition, I thought I saw something swirl past the windshield, a watery hand scraping the glass. I tore out of the sight, heart slamming against my ribs. That night, the coughing returned with a vengeance. Salt water poured from my mouth in the middle of the kitchen, leaving me breathless and shaky on the tile floor. My mind raced through countless scenarios. Was I becoming unhinged? Had the stress caused me to manifest these impossible events? The possibility terrified me almost as much as the actual visions. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those watery figures looming over my bed, dripping with malice and reaching for me with elongated arms. I decided I couldn't hide what was happening anymore. The next day, I gathered the courage to contact our project's environmental specialist. I remember speaking in a shaky voice, explaining I had concerns about an unknown water source on site. I described the flooding, though I stopped short of mentioning the humanoid shapes. The specialist assured me, in an even tone, that any anomalies would be investigated. While I recognized the professional courtesy, I also detected skepticism. When I went outside to meet them, I felt a shift in the atmosphere. The sky was surprisingly clear, and the sun glinted off the freshly reinforced steel beams. The environmental specialist took notes, collected a sample of soil, and commented that conditions seemed normal. My anxiety flared when they asked if I had gotten enough rest or if I might need some time off. That question made me realize no one truly believed me. It was as though I was trapped in a nightmare with no exit. In a final, desperate act to regain control, I spent the weekend away from the house. I drove inland, hoping the change of scenery would offer some relief. Initially, the absence of salt air and the comforting dryness of the land seemed to calm my nerves. I almost convinced myself that what I experienced was some twisted hallucination. But on the second night, I woke up in a cold sweat to find my motel sheets damp with that same algae smell. It was as if my torment had followed me, attached to me like a parasite. I returned to the construction site at dawn on Monday, determined to confront whatever was haunting me. As I stood at the edge of the excavated foundation, I felt the presence again. The air pulsed with a silent threat, and for a moment, I struggled to breathe. My chest seized, and a spasm of coughs racked my body. When it subsided, I was left gasping, my eyes watering. But something felt different. A surge of defiance coursed through my veins. The watery silhouettes flickered in my peripheral vision, but I refused to look away. I walked around the perimeter, ignoring the watery forms lurking at the edges of my vision. My heart thudded, my palms perspired, and my breath came in ragged bursts, but I kept moving. There was no flash of heroism, only grim resolve, and an odd sense of inevitability. As I made a final circuit around the pit, I realized the apparitions, the saltwater cough, the algae in my bed. They all felt like warnings rather than random horrors. Perhaps I was meant to heed them, to understand that nature itself, or something older and darker, was rejecting our intrusion. Climbing back into my truck, I felt an uneasy calm settle over me. I still tasted salt, and my body trembled with residual fear, but I found a strange clarity in the chaos. I suspected my warnings would continue to fall on deaf ears at the company. I might well be forced off the project, labeled unstable or overly anxious, and yet the haunting visions had also given me a perverse sense of purpose, to recognize a threat that others refused to see. Even now, as I write this account in the half-light of early evening, I hear water dripping. The taps in my house are tightly shut, yet the noise persists, a slow, rhythmic plop. My skin prickles at the familiarity of it. The salty taste lingers on my tongue, and I expect another round of coughing to seize me at any moment. But instead of feeling crushed by dread, I feel a grim determination. These watery forms and their silent warnings refuse to let me walk away oblivious. I don't pretend to understand what they truly are, whether manifestations of guilt, omens of disaster, or spirits of drowned landscapes that our construction threatens. I only know that they are real to me, as real as the throbbing of my own heart. Perhaps they will continue to test my resolve, to haunt my every step until I do something that reconciles what we are building with what the land can bear. Or maybe they will follow me forever, a constant reminder that some lines should never be crossed. I cannot say for sure what happens next. What I do know is that I'm filled with a restless vigilance, caught between fear and the unshakable conviction that I have glimpsed a hidden aspect of reality. The watery figures remain just at the edges of my vision, their silent message clear. We trespass at our own peril. Even if no one else believes me, I have felt their pull, tasted their brine, and woken with their algae in my bed. My life has changed irrevocably, and whenever I close my eyes, I see them waiting, just beneath the surface, ready to rise if we ignore their warning. The knowledge sits in my bones like a chill I'll never fully escape. Story 7. I felt the shift in the atmosphere even before I opened my eyes that morning. It was as if the walls of my apartment were closing in on me, surrounding me with an inexplicable heaviness. Every breath felt tighter in my chest, and the soft hum of the traffic outside sounded strangely distant, like a faint echo from a reality just out of reach. Something was wrong. I couldn't name it yet, but there was a quiet dread in the air that refused to let me go. I pushed the uneasy feeling aside, telling myself it was nothing more than leftover anxiety from a restless night. I had no idea it was a harbinger of everything that would follow. I always start my mornings by double-checking the time on my phone. The screen flared to life, and I noticed the date. It should have been an ordinary workday. No special events scheduled, no warnings from the Weather Channel, nothing unusual at all. Yet, a prickling at the back of my neck told me otherwise. My heart rate quickened, my palms felt clammy, and a chill ran down my spine. It wasn't cold in my apartment, but I found myself shivering as if a draft had seeped in through the windows. I pushed through the routine. It felt mechanical, but at least it was familiar. I made instant coffee, only to realize it tasted bitter on my tongue and left my mouth uncomfortably dry. Usually, I drink it without a second thought, but on that day, It felt like thick sludge. Every swallow felt forced, as though my own throat resisted my attempts to pretend everything was normal. By the time I made it to the lobby of my building, I was already behind schedule. The elevator doors slid open with an unsteady jerk, and I stepped in, hitting the button for the ground floor. Only one other person joined me, a figure in a dark gray suit who kept his head slightly down. The moment he got on, I felt a sudden drop in my stomach, as if the elevator had plummeted a few floors too quickly. The stranger was tall, his face partly cast in shadow by the fluorescent lights overhead, but I could see enough to realize there was something severely off. He looked up, and for a heartbeat my breath caught. His eyes were completely white. No iris, no pupil, just a milky, unsettling blankness. My hands started trembling against the steel railing inside the elevator. The hum of the fluorescent lights became maddeningly loud, like the static of a television set when a channel goes off air. I could hear the rapid pounding of my own heart echo in my ears. He spoke just a handful of words, the only direct sentence he uttered the entire time, but it rattled something deep inside me. He said, "Don't take the main road today." His voice was low and oddly resonant, hitting me in the chest as though the vibrations seeped under my skin. I wanted to ask what he meant, but no sound came out of my throat. He reached out and placed his hand on my shoulder, and it felt like I had been touched by an icicle. It was an intense, freezing pressure that made me gasp. My teeth practically chattered from that brief contact. Then he stepped off on the next floor, leaving me in the elevator alone, reeling from shock. A faint, ghostly chill remained on my shoulder, a handprint of cold that refused to fade. I should have brushed it off as a bizarre encounter, but the sense of foreboding deepened, twisting in my gut. The warning he gave was clear. I repeated it under my breath as I walked out into the parking garage, trying to make sense of it. Was it a threat? A joke? Or some deranged attempt at intimidation? My heart rate was still spiking, so I had a hard time thinking rationally. I glanced over my shoulder repeatedly, half expecting to see him lurking in the corner. Every step I took echoed in that concrete chamber, magnifying my already rattled nerves. When I finally got to my car, I felt momentarily safer, though I couldn't shake the icy residue on my shoulder. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw nothing unusual. Still, my heartbeat refused to slow. The memory of those white eyes bore into my mind like a drill, gnawing at my sense of normalcy. The elevator doors, the hum of the lights, and that voice warning me, telling me not to take the main road. As I was about to drive out, habit took over. My usual route to work involved a straight shot down the main road that cut through the center of town. But something in my gut twisted violently at the thought of ignoring the stranger's warning. I decided to skip the main road entirely. Instead, I took a back route. It added 10 extra minutes, weaving around side streets, but I couldn't bear to risk it. As I navigated the lesser-used roads, I tried to rationalize my decision. I told myself I was just being safe. Better to be cautious than regretful. Halfway to the office, at a stop sign, I adjusted my rearview mirror and froze. For a brief second, I caught sight of a reflection that wasn't my own. A warped image of twisted metal, shattered glass, and something ablaze in the distance. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a cold sweat prickling my scalp. Then I blinked, and it was gone, leaving me staring at my own pale face and wide eyes. My heart thudded. I thought I might pass out from the surge of adrenaline. By the time I arrived at work, my legs felt weak, and a wave of nausea had settled in the pit of my stomach. People greeted me in passing, but I responded only with vague nods, too distracted by the bizarre vision to muster a friendly word. One coworker noticed my ashen expression and asked if I was feeling all right, but I only mumbled that I must have eaten something off. The truth was too unsettling to share. I doubted they would believe me anyway. I tried to lose myself in spreadsheets and emails, focusing on the mundane tasks of the day, yet my mind kept wandering back to that reflection in the rearview mirror. Had I hallucinated? Maybe I was more stressed than I realized. My chest felt tight, and I had to take deep, deliberate breaths to keep from panicking. Hours dragged on in that suffocating office. Bright fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the stale smell of too many people in one space. An uneasy hum seemed to settle beneath everything, like a constant reminder that something was about to go terribly wrong. During lunch, I went to grab a bottled water from the vending machine in a deserted hallway. As I leaned forward to pick up the bottle, I caught another reflection, this time in the glass front of the machine. A flicker of metal, a flash of headlights, and standing right in the middle of the road was that stranger from the elevator, wearing that dark gray suit, those white eyes staring right at me. Then the image shattered like it had been struck. I jerked backwards so fast that I nearly knocked over a trash bin. My heart hammered in my rib cage. The hallway was empty, the reflection gone, but I still felt the chill, like I had glimpsed another reality bleeding through the reflective surface. That was the moment I started doubting my own sanity. My rational mind told me I was imagining things, that maybe I was in the middle of a stress-induced episode. I had heard about the mind playing tricks under pressure, about illusions that could seem terribly real. Yet the cold weight on my shoulder felt unmistakable, like a bruise that wouldn't fade. Throughout the day, I continued to see brief flashes of that same horrifying scene in every reflective surface. In the elevator doors at my office, I saw a twisted pile of cars, twisted metal glinting under harsh sunlight. In the gleaming handle of a bathroom faucet, I caught a glimpse of the stranger's grin, only for a second, but it was enough to make my stomach drop. That smile was unnaturally wide, as though he took pleasure in the chaos he was causing. I questioned whether any of it was real, or if I was truly slipping into madness. By the time I left the office, it was already getting dark. The lights in the parking lot buzzed with a low drone, casting sickly yellow pools on the asphalt. I stood at my car, key in hand, and stared at the main road in the distance. Nighttime always made it harder to see clearly, and I had an overwhelming urge to go check whether everything was okay on that stretch of highway, just to prove to myself I was imagining all these nightmarish reflections. But my gut warned me not to. My skin prickled with goosebumps, and the dread in my chest grew heavier, like a physical weight pressing down on me. I remembered that whisper in the elevator, "Don't take the main road today." I decided to heed the warning again. It wasn't just caution anymore. It was desperation. My sense of self-preservation was overshadowed by pure fear. Driving home through back roads was nerve-wracking in the dark. The streetlights were sparse, and every shadow seemed to shift and quiver. The trees lining the edge of the road felt like looming silhouettes ready to snatch my car off the pavement. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. About halfway home, an overwhelming urge made me check my side mirror. My pulse thundered in my ears when I saw, just for a split second, that familiar vision, a horrifying collision, metal scraping on metal, the flash of broken glass fanning across the asphalt, and in the center of it all stood the stranger. He gazed straight at me through the reflection, mouth curved in that same malignant smile. A wave of cold sweat enveloped my body. I felt my foot press on the brake reflexively. In reality, the road ahead was empty, no sign of an accident, but my heart wouldn't stop pounding. I fought the impulse to scream. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I had to pull over to the shoulder to steady myself. I lost track of how long I sat there with my head resting on the steering wheel, heart battering my ribs. Eventually, I managed to start the car again and make it home. I couldn't focus on anything else that night. I skipped dinner, feeling too nauseous to eat. My apartment felt eerily silent, as if the walls were holding their breath. That oppressive sense of being watched never left me. I kept seeing the stranger in the corners of my eyes whenever I passed by a mirror or a window. The reflection would vanish the moment I looked directly at it, but each fleeting sighting left me quivering with raw fear. I paced my living room, lights turned on in every corner to chase away the claustrophobic darkness, and yet the shadows felt heavier, almost alive. My mouth was bone dry, my tongue felt thick, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. In a desperate attempt to regain control, I forced myself to do mundane tasks, fold laundry, wash dishes, anything to keep my mind occupied. But each time I glanced at the faucet or the shiny surface of a plate, I braced for another flicker of that terrible vision. The anxiety grew into a suffocating force. I realized I wasn't just afraid of seeing something supernatural. I was terrified by the looming possibility that I might not be losing my mind after all. What if these visions were warnings? I tried to remember everything about that stranger. His colorless eyes, the weight of his hand on my shoulder, the echo of his voice. How could he appear to me in reflections of events that hadn't happened yet? Why would he specifically warn me about the main road? And how was he at the center of this imaginary accident? The questions twisted my thoughts into a labyrinth of paranoia. I considered calling someone, maybe a close friend, to explain the bizarre day I'd had. But I couldn't bring myself to say it out loud. It sounded insane. That night, I barely slept. My dreams were fraught with distorted highways and the stench of burning rubber. I woke multiple times, drenched in sweat, the echo of twisted metal reverberating in my ears. Each time I swore I could feel that icy handprint searing through the fabric of my shirt. Morning arrived, but it brought no relief. A thick fog loomed outside, making everything look gray and lifeless. My anxiety resurged with full force. I had to leave for work again, had to drive again. The idea of taking the main road made me physically recoil. My heartbeat spiked just imagining it. Every fiber of my being resisted the thought. So I stuck to the back roads. The fog made visibility poor, and my hands practically vibrated on the steering wheel. Every so often I glanced at my mirrors, terrified I'd see that impending accident or the stranger's chilling stare. A few times I thought I saw a shape crossing the road in front of me, a tall figure in gray. But when I blinked, it was gone. Each false sighting sent my heart on a rampage. Eventually I decided I couldn't keep living in this cycle of fear. The dread was consuming me. Maybe I needed to confront whatever this was. The next day I woke up determined. My plan was simple. I would take the main road and see if anything happened. Was it a reckless idea? Probably. But I couldn't continue to be a prisoner to these visions. My sanity hinged on proving once and for all that there was no real accident awaiting me. I left earlier than usual to avoid heavy traffic, my entire body buzzing with tension. The drive along the main road started uneventfully. The morning light was still weak, and the lampposts were just switching off. My heart hammered so violently, I could hear the rush of blood in my ears. For a while, everything seemed normal. No twisted metal, no glimpses of the stranger, just a quiet, almost tranquil drive. Then, up ahead, I noticed a faint silhouette standing on the pavement. My stomach twisted into a knot. As I got closer, the figure came into sharper focus. He was dressed in gray, with his back turned to me. A chill deeper than anything I'd felt before slithered across my spine. My breath caught, and my vision tunneled momentarily. I slowed down, trying to steady my trembling hands on the wheel. It was him, no doubt about it. My pulse raced, and my skin prickled with goosebumps. His head slowly turned, those white eyes locking onto me from a distance, and an eerie grin curled across his face. An unimaginable terror surged in my chest, and for a split second, the world blinked. I saw a flash of the accident scene overlap with my reality, a massive collision, a deafening crunch of metal, and the taste of burnt air in my lungs. But in the very next instant, the vision evaporated, leaving him standing there, unscathed, grinning. I slammed on the brakes, tires squealing. The car lurched, but stopped short of the figure. Then I blinked again, and he was gone, vanished as though he had never been there. My heart felt like it was going to burst from my chest. Breath ragged, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard they ached. I looked around. No sign of twisted metal or broken glass. The road was smooth and empty. Just a few early commuters driving by, oblivious to my panic. It dawned on me then that maybe that was the whole point. The stranger was a warning in human form, or perhaps something less than human. A harbinger whose message was never about harming me, but about preventing a catastrophe. Or maybe he was the catalyst, feeding off my fear. I'll never be certain. The sense of looming disaster was still there, pulsing under my skin. Yet nothing had physically happened. It was all potential, all possibility trapped in reflections and fleeting visions. I sat there, engine idling, hands shaking on the wheel. My entire body trembled with adrenaline. I decided to turn around and head back the way I came, relieved beyond measure that I'd managed to avoid whatever fate was tied to that grisly scene. The memory of the stranger's malevolent smile still flickered in my mind, but I refused to let it control me anymore. By the time I made it onto a side street, tears of sheer tension welled in my eyes. My chest was so tight it felt like I might break apart. Even now, I can't fully explain what happened or why. I continue to see small flickers of him in reflective surfaces from time to time. Just a split second of that expression. Those white eyes, the silent warning echoing inside me. Sometimes I feel the cold imprint on my shoulder, a phantom chill that makes me shudder. And occasionally I still see glimpses of twisted metal and shards of glass shining in the darkness. Yet none of it has happened in my world, or at least not in the way my visions foretold. I've grown used to living with the weight of possible disaster lingering just out of sight. That oppressive sense of being watched never completely disappeared, but I've managed to keep going. The road I take now is rarely the main one, and I can't deny the relief I feel when I avoid it. Perhaps the real terror lies not in the event itself, but in the knowledge that someone, knows our fate before we do, and can toy with us using just the slightest brush of a hand. I go about my days with the gnawing certainty that reality is not as solid as I once believed. There is another layer, a darker reflection of what might be, waiting for the tiniest misstep to manifest. And in that reflection stands the stranger, eyes blank and unreadable, always smiling. I'm never entirely sure if I've outmaneuvered destiny or if I'm simply delaying the inevitable. Either way, I wake up every morning with a cold knot of dread in my stomach, remembering his warning and feeling the phantom ice of his touch on my shoulder. I've chosen to heed the message, but the question remains, is it protection or a silent promise that one day the mirror and reality will collide? Even now, as I write this, I glance occasionally at the black screen of my phone, half expecting to see him staring back at me through the reflection. My heart hammers at the mere possibility. The world outside continues, oblivious to the creeping terror that lurks in corners and glass panes. But I'll never look at a reflection the same way again. Not after that day in the elevator, when a single, haunting sentence changed the shape of my reality forever. And somewhere, I'm certain he's still out there, waiting for me to forget. Just long enough for him to catch me by surprise, trapped in a shimmering vision of twisted metal and unstoppable fate. Story 8. I arrived on campus that afternoon, and the sky overhead was already thick with an unsettling gloom. The clouds seemed to hang lower than usual, pressing down on the old ornate buildings that made up the college grounds. I caught myself rubbing my arms, unsure if the chill I felt was from the weather or from something I couldn't yet name. My heart pounded steadily, too loud in my ears, and every breath felt shallow. The sight of those familiar Gothic spires should have been comforting. I had spent years of my life beneath their shadows. Yet on that day, they felt like watchful sentinels, looming over me with quiet disapproval. Even as I greeted other returning alumni with quick smiles and nods, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was following me with unseen eyes. I forced myself to attend a few of the official reunion events, but I was too restless to stay. My skin prickled with a vague sense of unease, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. Memories of late-night study sessions in the old library tugged at me, drawing me away from the social gatherings. It struck me that I hadn't visited the library since the day I graduated, and the sudden urge to see it again was overwhelming. Perhaps it was nostalgia or simply the desire to see if that massive labyrinth of books still held the same musty smell of knowledge and time that it had in my student days. As I walked through the campus corridors toward the library, the wind picked up and sent leaves skittering across the cobblestone paths. I felt my heart rate accelerate again. There was an air of loneliness permeating the campus that afternoon. Most of the alumni were gathered in the main hall for a dinner. The library, as I soon realized, was unusually deserted. I paused at the door, noticing how the tall wooden entrance, carved with intricate patterns of ivy and gargoyles, looked darker than I remembered. My hand shook as I pressed it against the aged wood to push the door open. The hinges groaned, echoing in the vast foyer, and my breath caught in my throat. Inside, a faint flickering light illuminated the main reading room. There were sconces set into the walls, casting weak beams across rows of shelves. The scent of old books and dust washed over me like a wave of memory. I noticed immediately how silent it was. Not the peaceful silence of a studying atmosphere, but a dense, oppressive hush that felt alive. My pulse hammered as I took cautious steps forward. Each footstep on the polished floor sounded too loud, as though the entire building was listening. I decided to wander through the aisles, checking for any changes. Most of the shelves looked the same, long corridors of leather-bound tomes, their spines faded from decades of handling. The overhead lights hummed faintly, and I felt a subtle vibration beneath my fingertips whenever I ran my hand along the shelves. Something about that slight hum made my teeth ache. It felt unnatural, like a latent energy trapped in the old wiring. Occasionally, I thought I heard light footsteps behind me, but when I turned, there was no one there. My chest tightened, and sweat beaded on my forehead. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, fueled by memories of late nights in this place when I was too tired to see straight. I reached the far side of the library where the rare book section was cordoned off by a heavy iron gate. A single overhead lamp illuminated the hallway leading to the locked entrance. I remembered my younger self standing there, peering longingly at the ancient volumes I could never touch without permission. For some reason, the gate was open now. My stomach churned with a mixture of curiosity and dread. My throat felt dry, and my breathing quickened as I stepped inside. The rare book section smelled different, more pungent and sharp, like old parchment dipped in vinegar. My eyes strained to adjust to the dimness. There was a single reading table in the middle of the section, and I could make out a figure seated there. An older man, hunched over a large book. He looked up as I approached, meeting my gaze with intense, glittering eyes. I could feel my heart drumming against my ribcage as I halted. For a moment, I hesitated to speak. Even in the faint light, I noticed how his skin was pallid, nearly translucent, and his hands were unnaturally still on the pages of the book. He seemed to know me, though. He nodded as if greeting an old friend. He made a brief remark about me returning to my old haunt, referencing some obscure paper I had written for a literature seminar many years ago. My body tensed, and a cold sweat trickled down my spine. I had never shared that paper outside my class. It wasn't even something I had discussed casually. Yet, he referred to it in detail, noting specific arguments I had made, and even the professor's marginal notes. I felt my mouth go dry. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I could taste the metallic tang of adrenaline at the back of my throat. I managed a muttered question, trying to understand how he knew this. He leaned forward, describing personal moments from my life that I was certain no one else knew. Private conversations, regrets I had buried deep, small secrets I never put on paper. With each revelation, a surge of panic roiled in my chest. My breaths became ragged, and I felt beads of sweat forming on my forehead. I tried to regain composure, but the more he spoke, the more my surroundings seemed to fade into an unbearable hush, as though the library itself was holding its breath. Desperate to ground myself, I took a step back. The tension in my muscles was so strong that my legs nearly gave out. I stammered something about not understanding who he was or how he had this knowledge. He merely smiled, a small, tight curve of his lips, and gestured to the book in front of him, a large ledger of some kind. Without a word, he turned it around so that it faced me. My stomach lurched at the sight. It was a library register, dated from the 1800s, filled with rows of neat, spidery handwriting. On the last page used, I saw an elaborate signature, swirling letters scrawled in black ink. The date was 1888, and yet the signature was unmistakably in my handwriting. My hands began to tremble uncontrollably. I tried to form a coherent question, but my throat felt too tight to speak. My body shuddered with an odd mixture of terror and incredulity. I could sense the rush of blood pounding in my ears, a pulsing tidal wave of dread. It felt like the temperature dropped several degrees in that moment. My breath fogged in front of my face, and every hair on my body stood on end. The old man tapped a finger on the register, and his nails looked strangely long, clicking against the yellowed page. Then he said something about destiny being etched beyond our understanding, but I only heard the rush of my own heartbeat as I stumbled backward. I turned, intending to sprint out of there, but something made me pause. My vision swam, black spots dancing at the edges, and I gripped a nearby shelf to steady myself. When I glanced back toward the table, the old man was gone. The ledger remained open, the signature burning itself into my mind. I whispered a few urgent pleas under my breath, wanting to believe this was a bizarre prank or my eyes playing tricks on me. My entire body shook. A wave of cold sweat dripped along my spine, making my clothes cling to my damp skin. The building's silence pressed in on me even harder, magnifying the sound of my panting breaths. I must have stood there for several minutes, paralyzed by confusion. Eventually, I forced myself to leave the rare book section. My legs felt like lead, my footsteps sluggish and uneven. Every shadow seemed alive with threats. A faint static buzz filled my ears, and I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a window. Hollow eyes, face pale, hair plastered to my forehead with sweat. I felt more like a trembling specter than a living man. Back in the main reading room, a few alumni were now wandering around, taking pictures or reminiscing about old times. My body was still quivering, but a slight relief washed over me at the sight of other people. I spotted a friendly face from my year and approached, desperate for some sense of normalcy. They commented on how I looked pale and shaken, and I tried to explain that I had just had a strange encounter in the rare book section. My words tumbled out in a hurried, breathless rush, and my friends seemed concerned. According to them, that area was locked tight and no one should have been inside. My heart raced again. A prickling terror spread across my skin. My friends said they would help me investigate, but I hesitated. The memory of that old man's eyes was too fresh, too terrifying. A few of us took a group photo in the main reading room to commemorate the reunion. I kept glancing around, scanning the corners for any sign of that presence. My mouth was dry, and my fingertips tingled with residual panic. The camera flashes felt too bright, leaving behind greenish afterimages that danced in the air. Every time the flash went off, a part of me feared that I might see the old man lurking in the background, that pale face lit up by the harsh light. Later, when I checked the photos, my dread took on a whole new dimension. In one shot, I appeared to be standing alone near a table, my arms raised in an odd gesture. Yet I distinctly remembered talking to someone at that table, an elderly figure wearing a dark suit. In the photo, there was only empty space where I swore he had stood. My heart thumped painfully against my ribs, and my skin broke out in goosebumps so intense they felt like pinpricks. A sour taste filled my mouth, and my hand shook so badly I almost dropped my phone. I felt that same sense of being observed, though I couldn't see anyone watching me. The overhead lights suddenly seemed too bright, exposing every vulnerability on my face. My panic escalated as the evening wore on, and I decided I had to return to that rare book section for some kind of closure. It was a reckless urge, but I couldn't live with the uncertainty gnawing at my sanity. Part of me feared that if I left now, I'd never have the courage to come back. So, while most other alumni made their way to the dining hall, I slipped away and retraced my steps to the library. The corridors were dimly lit, and with each turn my pulse quickened. My skin felt clammy, and the air seemed stale, as if no one had breathed it for centuries. Back at the iron gate of the rare book section, I found it locked once more. My heart hammered in my chest as I rattled the gate in frustration. The overhead bulb flickered wildly, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Suddenly, from somewhere behind the door, I heard a soft scraping sound, like pages turning or nails scratching on wood. My breath caught, and I stood there, paralyzed by indecision. My mind spun with possibilities. I imagined the old man behind those shelves, waiting with that ledger, ready to confront me with more impossible truths. The hair on my arms stood on end, and I felt a clammy sweat break out on my forehead. Summoning a jolt of adrenaline, I tried the latch again, and this time, it gave way with a rusty squeak. My breathing became ragged as I pushed the gate open. The space beyond was darker than before, as though the single lamp had burnt out. I fished out my phone and turned on its flashlight, the beam trembling with the shake of my hand. The shelves loomed like tall sentries, and every footstep echoed ominously. The smell of old parchment was more pungent now, almost suffocating. My lungs felt tight, and my heart pounded in my throat, making me swallow hard. When I reached the table, it was empty save for one object, that same ledger from 1888, now closed. My flashlight revealed deep scratches on the table's surface, like something had been digging into the wood. My gut twisted at the thought of those long nails I'd seen tapping against the pages earlier. The temperature in the room felt ice cold, and I could see the puff of my breath in the beam of light. A pressure weighed on my chest, and I had to force each inhalation, as though some invisible force was squeezing the air out of me. Despite every fiber of my being screaming at me to run, I reached out and touched the book. Its cover was rough and cracked, the leather peeling at the edges. My throat tightened. Slowly, I opened it. My flashlight revealed the final entry, the date in Victorian script, and that signature. My signature. The letters were unmistakable. My hand trembled, and my stomach churned in fearful disbelief. I felt a sharp prickling at the back of my neck, as though someone were staring at me. In the silence, I heard a faint, erratic shuffle, like footsteps in the next aisle. I spun around, my flashlight beam bouncing off shelves, capturing swirls of dust in the air. No one was there. I couldn't stay in that room any longer. Panic shot through me, and I clutched the ledger tightly, determined to show proof of what I'd seen. My legs felt weak, but fear propelled me forward. I stumbled out of the rare books section, the old iron gate clanging shut behind me. The corridor outside felt marginally brighter, but my chest was still tight, and my muscles still twitched with residual terror. I half ran, half limped back toward the main library entrance. My palms were slick with sweat, making the ledger slippery in my grip. Once I reached the foyer, I paused to catch my breath. My heart still hammered away, and I pressed a hand to my chest, feeling each frantic thud. The overhead light suddenly flickered violently. I heard an electrical snap, and then everything went dark. My breath came in ragged bursts, and I had to swallow down the urge to scream. In that stifling darkness, I felt the presence again, closer, more oppressive. My skin tingled, and a chill spread through my limbs. My phone's flashlight was my only comfort, the small circle of light revealing the path to the exit. I forced myself to move forward, ignoring the trembling in my knees and the dryness in my throat. The door finally came into view. My hand closed around its handle, and I pushed it open, nearly falling onto the steps outside. The cool air of the campus night felt like deliverance. I gasped, filling my lungs with fresh oxygen. My heartbeat slowly began to settle, but the sense of dread lingered, like a stain that wouldn't wash away. I glanced back at the library, half expecting to see the old man watching from a window. Instead, I just saw the dark, empty facade staring back at me. I made my way across the campus lawn, clutching the ledger. Light spilled from the dining hall where the reunion was still going on, laughter and clinking dishes wafting out into the night. Somehow that normalcy felt surreal, almost cruel, in contrast to what I had just experienced. I stepped inside, my eyes darting nervously across the room. Several classmates glanced my way, concern etched on their faces, but I ignored their curious looks. Instead, I found a quiet corner and set the ledger on a table under a bright lamp. My hands were shaking so badly that I had trouble opening it. Once I managed, I stared again at that uncanny signature. identical to my own, dated almost a century and a half earlier. At that moment, I felt a spark of terrifying realization flicker in my mind. Something about the final lines in that ledger entry hinted at the role of a librarian, a caretaker of books and secrets. The words were ambiguous, referencing the keeper of knowledge and guide of wandering souls. My chest tightened, and I recalled the old man's features, the piercing eyes, the pallid skin, the surety with which he spoke. I felt my face burn with a sudden rush of blood. A nauseating swirl of thoughts cascaded through my mind. Was I somehow destined to become that figure? Or had I already been that figure in some twisted timeline? Each breath tasted sour, and my trembling intensified. I closed the ledger, the pages rustling in protest. My reflection in its worn leather cover looked haunted, drenched in sweat, my eyes wide with shock. I wanted to fling it away from me, but part of me realized that I could never truly escape what I'd seen. My lips quivered, and a sheen of cold sweat clung to my brow. The entire dining hall around me seemed to fade into a distant murmur, my sense of reality warping under the weight of a secret I was never meant to uncover. I left the reunion shortly after. No one tried to stop me. I walked back across the campus grounds, feeling as though each footstep echoed with finality. The wind had died down, and a heavy stillness gripped the night, as if the entire college was holding its breath, waiting. Even the sky seemed darker, devoid of moon or stars. My pulse still raced, and my mouth felt parched, each breath scraping against my dry throat. When I finally slid into my car and locked the doors, my reflection in the rearview mirror startled me. I looked older, drained. My skin was ashen, and the shadows under my eyes looked bruised. My heart pounded, and my fingers tingled with a combination of fear and adrenaline. As I drove away, I couldn't help glancing in the mirror more than once, half expecting to see that old man in the back seat, silently watching me, but there was only emptiness. Now, every time I look at my handwriting, I'm reminded of that inscription from 1888. Every time I pass a dusty row of old books, I recall the oppressive hush of that library corridor. And every time my mind drifts to that day, I feel the same cold shiver course through my body. I can't decide which possibility unsettles me more, that I met a manifestation of my own fate, or that I hallucinated the entire incident due to stress. Yet the photographs, those empty spaces where I was sure another presence had stood, remain. The ledger's signature remains. Sometimes, late at night, I catch myself reaching for a pen, my hand tempted to replicate the swirling letters. My pulse surges at the thought, and a clammy sweat breaks out along my arms. I clench my fists to resist the urge, but I can't help wondering if, in some twisted corner of time, I have already taken up that role. I escaped the library without losing my life or falling to some tragic fate. But I suspect a part of me never really left that place, tethered to those dusty shelves and forgotten secrets. The memories stay with me, gnawing at the edges of my sanity, reminding me that truth can be more terrifying than any nightmare. Even now, the faint smell of parchment or the echo of footsteps in a quiet hallway can send a sharp pang of anxiety through my chest, and I realize that no matter how far I travel, the shadows of that library and the mysteries of that ledger will haunt me forever. Story 9. I remember the precise moment the atmosphere shifted. My apartment was already dim. The overhead light had a habit of flickering at the worst times, yet the air suddenly felt heavy, as though it were charged with a hidden, looming intent. My heartbeat quickened without any immediate reason. A wave of cold sweat beaded along my temples, and a pulse of dread washed over me. That was the first sign something was terribly off. I lived alone in a modest space at the edge of the city, where the nights stretched on forever and the silence was rarely broken by more than the buzz of old lamps. My friend Ethan often came over for a beer or just to talk about the day. We'd been inseparable since college, sharing half-formed plans for the future and the occasional regret about the past. Lately, though, Ethan had been different, distracted, anxious, and reluctant to share why. He had once confided to me that he felt like he was being watched, but he quickly changed the topic afterward, almost as if regretting he had said anything at all. At first, I chalked it up to stress from work or some private issue he didn't feel comfortable discussing. The idea of a supernatural presence didn't cross my mind. But everything changed the night I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my living room. It was supposed to be a normal evening. Ethan was sitting across from me, leaning back in his chair, eyes half-lidded from exhaustion. The overhead light flickered, and I swore I saw a second figure in the shadowed corner, a shape that mirrored Ethan's silhouette, yet was somehow distorted at the edges, like a painting smudged by careless fingers. My throat tightened, and my heart hammered so hard that I momentarily forgot to breathe. The shape was gone in an instant, leaving me with just the tail end of that anxious flutter in my chest. I tried to compose myself, but my hands were clammy, and an unsteady tremor ran through my limbs. I asked if Ethan felt there was something in the corner. He just frowned at me and turned around, but I noticed the tension in his shoulders as he did so. He said, in a low voice, that he saw nothing. There was a rigid finality in his tone, no space for me to press further. I dropped the subject, but my skin was still crawling with the memory of that twisted outline. Over the following days, I found that the feeling of being watched grew worse whenever Ethan was around. At times, I swore the corners of my own vision were tinted with movement, shapes half-formed and dancing in the periphery. It made my pulse spike and my breath catch. I tried to ignore the drumming in my chest whenever these illusions happened, but the tension coiled in the pit of my stomach was impossible to deny. It was as if every instinct in my body screamed that something unnatural was creeping around me, around us. One evening, Ethan asked me to help him go through some old photos on his phone. He was organizing them for a project. Our past adventures flashed on the screen: road trips, barbecues, random snapshots from our college dorm. At first, the memories were comforting, moments of innocence, back when we had fewer worries. But then we came across a series of recent photos he'd taken at his place. My eyes locked onto a detail that spiked an immediate jolt of alarm. In nearly every image that showed Ethan's face, there was a faint overlay of another face, partially merged with his. The second face was twisted, as if it belonged to someone in agony or furious with the world. I felt my throat constrict, a metallic taste rising in my mouth. I tried to steady my breathing, but it only made my chest tighter. Ethan stared at the pictures, his face drained of color. He didn't have any explanation. He simply mumbled something about them being glitches. But his voice shook, and I could see his lips were trembling. Soon, we both fell silent. The photos felt tainted, as though we were peering into something we were never meant to see. My eyes burned from staring too long at those contorted features, searching for any rational explanation. None came. That night, I barely slept. My heart seemed to thunder in my ears, refusing to settle into a quiet rhythm. Every time my eyelids drifted shut, I saw that distorted face superimposed over Ethan's. The next day, I went to visit Ethan at his apartment. The air inside felt stagnant. The curtains were drawn tight, letting in only thin slivers of daylight. The dimness seemed to amplify every small movement, every half-imagined shape in the corners. I noticed a damp chill that clung to my skin, making the hair on my arms stand up. My mouth had gone dry, and I found myself swallowing repeatedly just to ease the scratchiness in my throat. I tried asking Ethan what he thought was happening. He spoke indirectly, using vague statements about nightmares and half-remembered whispers in the middle of the night. He mentioned hearing his name being called, but the voice sounded like a cruel imitation of his own. Occasionally he'd freeze, as though lost in a waking dream, and then snap back with a shudder, blinking rapidly. I couldn't shake the feeling that every wall in that apartment was closing in on me. The darkness in the corners felt alive, buzzing with potential horrors my rational mind struggled to deny. Over the course of a few weeks, Ethan's mannerisms grew more disturbing. He began to mirror that twisted presence I thought I'd seen in my living room. He would stand too straight or tilt his head at unnerving angles, as if something inside him was adjusting his body to a more unnatural posture. Sometimes, he had this faraway look in his eyes, and when I spoke to him, his responses came out in a hushed monotone. My instincts screamed that something was very wrong with him. Each time I tried to bring it up, he would go blank, giving me only clipped replies that left my skin tingling with unease. Despite my terror, I couldn't leave him to handle this alone. My friend was suffering. Or was it something worse than suffering? Maybe he was slipping into a state of complete disconnection from reality. I worried that, if I abandoned him, he might get lost in that darkness. I began sleeping over at his place, if only to keep an eye on him. But I quickly realized my presence did nothing to quell that oppressive aura lurking in every shadowed corner. At night, I'd lie awake on the living room couch, hearing Ethan pace in his bedroom. The floorboards groaned ominously beneath his restless footsteps. Occasionally, I'd hear a faint whisper that sounded nothing like him, drifting through the hush of the apartment. My heart would pound each time I caught those elusive words, and I'd have to clamp a hand over my mouth to stifle a gasp. The shadows in the corners seemed to ripple when I wasn't looking directly at them. A chill would skitter across my spine, and sweat would bead at my temples, making it nearly impossible to drift off to sleep. One night, I caught sight of a shape in the hallway mirror. I could barely see it by the dim glow of a single nightlight. Yet it was clearly Ethan's outline, but contorted. His face elongated, jaw slack, eyes sunken. My blood turned to ice, and my heart lurched violently, sending a jolt of nausea through my gut. I flicked on a nearby lamp, and the reflection vanished. Ethan was in his room, door closed, nowhere near the hallway. My breathing was ragged, and my palms were so slick with sweat that I had to wipe them against my shirt. My mind spun with the possibilities. Was I losing my grip on reality? Or was there a force tangling itself around Ethan, corrupting his very shape? Another time, I discovered scribbled notes strewn across Ethan's desk. They were rambling lines about how the images in his pictures didn't just appear on the screen. They were following him into mirrors, windows, and even the reflective surface of the microwave's door. He had jotted down confessions of feeling disoriented, as though he sometimes couldn't recall if he was awake or dreaming. He wrote that the presence had begun whispering twisted versions of our old memories, like the time we celebrated our college graduation. Only in this retelling, the presence described how it had been standing behind us all along. Reading these accounts, I felt my stomach tighten and bile rise in my throat. Every word was charged with dread, and my own reflection in the nearby window seemed to waver ominously, as though something stood behind me. My skin prickled, and I had to press my eyes shut for a moment to ground myself. I decided to confide in an acquaintance who was more open to unconventional explanations. They suggested a possible haunting or possession scenario, claiming I should burn sage or recite protective rites. But even as I considered these options, a deeper anxiety gnawed at me. What if this was simply a symptom of Ethan's mental breakdown, or worse, my own? I could not escape the feeling that, rational or not, something beyond my understanding was tightening its hold on him. One evening, I confronted Ethan more directly. I mentioned how the photos showed that second face, how I saw shapes and reflections. I spoke calmly, but my words came out in a near whisper, trembling from the effort to maintain composure. He stared at me, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of panic in his eyes. But then his expression went cold, almost lifeless. He insisted it was all just paranoia, that I needed to stop bringing it up. His tone was hollow. My chest constricted with helplessness. This used to be the friend who laughed with me over small triumphs, who shared quiet confessions when nights got too dark. Now I hardly recognized him. The sense of oppression in his apartment continued to intensify. Doors would creak open on their own. The hallway lights would dim in intervals that didn't match any electrical fault. On more than one occasion, the temperature in the living room dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath fog the air. My heart pounded so loud in those moments that I felt sure someone, or something, must hear it. Every time I tried to calm down, my lungs refused to fill properly with air. Fear took on a physical weight, pressing against my chest. Eventually, I couldn't contain my anxiety. I suggested we get out of the apartment for a while, maybe a short stay somewhere else just to clear our heads. Ethan hesitated, then relented. We drove to a motel on the outskirts of town, but the whole ride, he said almost nothing. As I maneuvered down the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that the thing wasn't confined to his home, that it clung to him. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and sweat pooled at the base of my spine. Every shadow in the car seemed to move with a predatory patience. At the motel, I booked a room with 2 beds. The lights were painfully fluorescent, but at least it felt safer than the stifling darkness of his apartment. For the first couple of hours, it was somewhat calm. No flickering shadows, no unnerving reflections. I dared to hope it had been left behind. But around midnight, I awoke to a whisper that snaked its way around my ears. My pulse kicked so fast that it pounded like an alarm inside my skull. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like a warped version of Ethan's voice, deep and layered with static. I flicked on the lamp, only to see Ethan standing at the foot of my bed. His eyes were wide, and his skin glistened with sweat. He appeared transfixed by something on the wall, something that no one else could see. He eventually stumbled back to his bed, trembling, as though something inside him had relented. I lay awake for the rest of the night, my body vibrating with adrenaline. Every breath hurt, raw and ragged in my throat. The following morning, I discovered that while I might escape the apartment, I couldn't escape the dread that had seeped into my mind. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked pale, drawn. Every small sound made me jerk in alarm, a creak in the pipes, a gust of wind against the window. I felt hunted by an invisible presence, powerless to confront it directly. At dawn, Ethan was silent. He barely acknowledged me, his posture unnaturally stiff. When he blinked, there was a disconcerting lag, as if he were straining to remember how a human blink was supposed to happen. The presence clung to him more than ever, a living shadow that threaded itself through his movements. My own sense of reality wavered with every passing hour. It felt as though the motel walls pulsed, breathing with a malicious sentience. That same day, I reached a breaking point. My nerves were shot. My heart felt like it was going to punch a hole through my chest at any second. I announced that we had to do something drastic. We packed hastily, deciding to return to his apartment for whatever final confrontation might be needed, whether psychological or supernatural. My palms were slick with sweat on the drive back, and Ethan stared wordlessly out the window, his shoulders hunched and trembling. Stepping inside his place was like stepping into a tomb of stale electric fear. The lights barely worked, and an oppressive darkness loomed in every corner, thick as tar. I could almost taste the tension, bitter and metallic on my tongue. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. That distorted reflection of Ethan, materializing along the wall where his shadow should have been. This time, though, it wasn't flickering in and out. It was fully there, superimposed, as though standing just one step behind him. My breath caught in my throat, and my heart thundered so violently that it hurt. I refused to look away. Every instinct told me to run, but I forced myself to stand my ground. I felt an uncomfortable pull, as if the room itself was warping around me. Then Ethan's posture sagged, and for one terrifying moment, I sensed that the presence was looking directly at me from over his shoulder, like a reflection with a life of its own. I felt as though my sanity teetered on a knife's edge. My temples pounded, sweat rolled down my spine, and nausea churned in my stomach. But I found a reserve of courage I didn't know I had. Gritting my teeth, I confronted that twisted silhouette. In a trembling voice, I commanded it to leave us alone. My words not so much a shout, but a low, desperate plea. The presence seemed to ripple, its edges warping. Then slowly, agonizingly, it receded, folding itself back into the corner of the room. Ethan collapsed to his knees, gasping like he'd surfaced from drowning. I rushed to him, equally shaken. I didn't know if the presence was truly gone or just temporarily banished. But the air suddenly felt lighter, as if a suffocating weight had lifted. I was drenched in sweat, hands shaking, heart pounding like a jackhammer. My breath came in strained, shallow bursts. In the weeks since that confrontation, Ethan has been improving, cautiously, gradually. He avoids darkness whenever possible. I still catch glimpses of movement in the corners of my vision, but now it feels more like aftershocks rather than a full-blown haunting. My nights remain uneasy. My dreams are tainted with half-remembered whispers and twisted reflections. Sometimes I wonder if that presence ever truly left, or if it's simply biding its time. I've come to accept that there are horrors in this world that defy explanation. Whether it was a supernatural entity or a shared delusion born from stress, the terror we experienced was all too real. I wake up with my heart pounding and sweat matting my hair against my forehead, certain I've heard that low voice again. My throat goes dry at the memory of that twisted silhouette perched over Ethan's shoulder. Despite it all, I'm thankful no one was taken or destroyed, at least not physically. We're both changed, though, marked by the encounter. Late at night, when my mind races and the shadows in my room grow longer, I think about that presence. It didn't just haunt Ethan. It seeped into me as well. I feel it sometimes, lingering in the corners of my thoughts, waiting. Perhaps that's the most insidious part. Once you've seen it, once you've felt it worm its way into your life, you never really shake it off. It stays with you in every silent room, every dark hallway, every idle reflection. And no matter how strongly I tell myself we're safe, my heart never stops pounding with that lingering fear. Story 10. The night sky felt unnaturally heavy, as though every star had been smothered by a blanket of dark cloud. An oppressive silence clung to the edges of every street lamp, and the horizon stretched on like an unwelcoming void. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. That was the kind of night I found myself in. A night where everything felt just a little too still, a little too subdued, as though reality itself had receded to make room for something else. I remember leaving work under the glare of fluorescent lights that hummed too loudly for my tired brain. It was late, later than I should have stayed, but I'd been roped into finishing a project. When I finally walked out of the building, the parking lot was deserted. My footsteps echoed on the cracked asphalt as I approached my old sedan, a slight tremor in my hands when I reached for the door handle. Sometimes I get this vague sense of being watched, but I always brush it off. That night, it was stronger than usual. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck prickle the second I slid into the driver's seat. My car's engine coughed to life, and I turned on the headlights, illuminating an empty row of parked cars. The angle of the streetlights cast weird shadows against the walls of the lot, twisting the silhouettes of the vehicles into shapes that looked vaguely human. I tried to shake off a rising unease, attributing it to fatigue. After all, a long day at work can do ugly things to your mind. I drove out of the parking lot, entering a long, lonely stretch of road that snaked its way between industrial buildings, warehouses, and patches of overgrown grass. The place was eerily quiet at that hour. The only movement I saw was my own reflection in the rearview mirror, eyes glassy with exhaustion. That's when I noticed a pair of headlights behind me. They appeared so suddenly I actually flinched, a jolt of adrenaline shooting through my veins. They were bright, almost painfully so, and I squinted to see if it was a large truck or just a car with its high beams on. I couldn't make out the exact make or model, only that it seemed to ride closer to the ground, as if it were weighed down by something heavy. I muttered something under my breath about inconsiderate drivers and tried to focus on the road. But the feeling of unease crept back in. Something felt off about those headlights, the way they pressed against my rear bumper, then backed off, then returned again. It was a pattern, like the driver was testing me, gauging my reactions. My heartbeat quickened, a dull thud pulsing in my ears. Every time those lights loomed, I felt the same surge of adrenaline, and my palms started to sweat against the steering wheel. I tried changing lanes. The vehicle followed. I pressed a little harder on the gas. It matched my speed, always in my rearview mirror, unwavering. My breath grew shallow, and I caught myself tapping my foot nervously on the floorboard. For a moment, I contemplated pulling over to let the car pass. But something about the way it followed so closely made me hesitate. I decided to stay on the main road, confident I could lose it once I reached the better-lit areas closer to the highway. However, the route to the highway stretched for several more miles, winding past abandoned strip malls and shuttered gas stations. In the darkness, every shape became a potential threat. My eyes flicked from the road to the mirror, to the sides of the street, then back again. I noticed the headlights swaying slightly, like they were fixed onto some living thing rather than a machine. The alignment was off, or perhaps it was my mind playing tricks on me, but I almost thought they looked like two enormous bloodshot eyes. A creeping sense of dread gnawed at me. By the time I merged onto the highway, my heart was pounding so hard I could feel my pulse throbbing in my neck. The car behind me kept its distance at first, then advanced as though hungry for my tailpipe. My chest constricted with tension, and my fingers were stiff from gripping the steering wheel too tight. I told myself to calm down, but it was impossible. Every nerve in my body was on edge. I tried to focus on the highway's white lines zipping beneath my car, that rhythmic pattern that usually lulls me into a sort of driving trance. But those glaring lights in the mirror refused to let me slip into any comfort. They burned too bright, and I began to notice something else. The shape of the grille beneath those headlights seemed to warp. At first, I thought it was the reflection of passing lights across its metal edges, but the longer I looked, the more it resembled a crooked smile. I felt a bead of sweat roll down my temple, trailing an icy path along my skin. My throat went dry and I tried to clear it, but no matter how hard I swallowed, I couldn't get rid of the lump lodged there. The car behind me was definitely changing. The outline was less like a sedan or SUV, and more like some twisted creature with eyes too big for its face. Maybe I was hallucinating from exhaustion, but my gut told me to speed up. I pressed my foot down on the accelerator, watching the speedometer climb to numbers that made me uneasy. The wind roared past my windows, and I took a shaky breath. Traffic was sparse, only occasional headlights coming in the opposite direction, but that sinister vehicle kept pace. I glanced down at my phone, half tempted to call someone, anyone, just to hear another human voice. But a sense of shame and fear washed over me. Who would I call? And would they even believe me? At one point I turned on the radio, desperate for some distraction from the panic swirling in my mind. Static. I flicked through stations. Nothing but white noise. Then, through the crackle, I heard a voice. It was low, guttural, and too familiar. It sounded like the same person who was controlling the car behind me, whispering that we were locked in some endless chase. I stabbed the power button, heart hammering as the radio fell silent. My chest felt tight with terror, my breath hitching in staccato gasps. The road ahead seemed to stretch into infinity, no sign of an exit or rest stop. I felt trapped in the confines of my own car, the darkness outside pressing in. Every muscle in my body tensed when I realized that not only was the car behind me, but that I suddenly wasn't alone in my vehicle. I felt a presence. I forced myself to glance in the rearview mirror, expecting to see only my back seat. Instead, there was a figure, a dark silhouette with eyes that reflected the glare of the dashboard lights. I jerked the steering wheel in sheer horror, nearly veering into the next lane. My knuckles turned white, and I bit down on my lips so hard I tasted blood. Somehow, in that flicker of a moment, I recognized the face. It was the same face I had glimpsed for a second behind the wheel of the pursuing car, a face twisted in an expression of malicious glee. But it was here, in my back seat, breathing shallowly behind my shoulder. I didn't dare speak, but in my mind, I screamed. My pulse echoed in my ears, and a nauseating chill prickled my skin. When I forced myself to look back at the road, I nearly lost control of my car again. The highway sign ahead, one that should have listed the next town, was blank. It was just a metal rectangle with no words, no numbers, and the environment itself seemed to have shifted, as though I'd entered a section of highway that wasn't meant to exist. The roadsides offered no landmarks, only twisted silhouettes of trees and bushes that almost formed grotesque shapes. My rearview mirror twitched with movement, but I was too terrified to look again. The shape in my back seat wasn't rustling or speaking. It just sat there, an oppressive aura of malevolence filling the cramped interior. My skin tingled as though thousands of tiny needles pricked every nerve. I could hear the figure breathing, slow and steady, like it was savoring my fear. I thought about stopping, but every primal instinct screamed at me not to. Stopping meant confronting whatever was in the back seat, and I couldn't muster the courage. My body was locked in a perpetual state of fight or flight, with nowhere to run. The faster I drove, the more the presence in the back seemed to loom. Even the physical space of my car felt distorted, as though it were stretching to accommodate something that shouldn't be there. Then the radio sputtered on by itself, static hissing with sudden intensity. A broken voice emerged, telling me that there was no escape, that the road would loop forever, and that the chase had only just begun. I tried turning the radio off again, but the power button refused to respond. I pressed it with increasing desperation, but the voice continued, each word like a jagged piece of glass in my ears. My stomach churned, and my vision blurred around the edges. Outside, the other vehicle was still present, but now it rode alongside me instead of behind, separated only by a few yards of pavement. Out of the corner of my eye, I glimpsed its hood. The metal looked as though it had been clawed, and the headlights flickered, showing glimpses of something fleshy beneath the cracked glass. I wanted to believe it was some optical illusion, maybe the reflection of the moonlight or my own headlights distorting the image, but each time I glanced over, it looked more like a living thing, with the grille pulled into a grotesque grin. I started to feel lightheaded, and I loosened my grip on the steering wheel just enough to keep it steady. The seatbelt felt too tight, constricting my chest. My breath came in shallow bursts, and I could smell my own sweat. The dryness in my mouth made it impossible to swallow. It was like I'd entered a waking nightmare, except no matter how many times I blinked, I couldn't shake it off. There was a momentary respite when the road curved sharply. The other car had to drop back behind me, and for the first time in what felt like hours, I exhaled a ragged breath. But that relief was short-lived. My rearview mirror showed it pulling up again, tailgating me so closely I feared it would ram into my bumper. I tried to accelerate away, but I felt a pressure in my chest, like a panic attack threatening to consume me. I dared another look in the mirror, bracing myself. The figure in the back seat was gone, but a new dread seized me. If it wasn't behind me, where was it? My eyes darted frantically around the interior, half expecting a cold hand to clamp down on my shoulder. Nothing. The seat was empty, but the sense of being watched never left. In fact, it grew more intense. I caught a glimpse of motion outside my passenger window. A shape flitted there, alongside my car, like a shadow riding the wind. My spine turned to ice. It was the same shape I'd seen behind the wheel of the other car, the same shape I'd seen in my back seat. How it managed to appear outside my window while simultaneously driving that demonic vehicle behind me was beyond comprehension. I felt my sanity slipping, my thoughts growing more erratic. The radio crackled again. Through the static, I heard that voice laughing, a deep, raspy sound that made my skin crawl. It told me we were circling the same stretch of highway over and over, that every mile was a repetition of the one before, and that I was doomed to keep running forever. My throat constricted. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I felt as though I was suffocating on raw fear. I looked at the roadside signs, desperately trying to find a way out. But every exit sign was blank, every billboard empty. The trees looked the same, twisted into the same gnarled shapes, as though they'd been planted in a row for miles. I realized with dawning horror that I couldn't recall how many minutes, or hours, I'd been driving. My phone showed no signal, the time stuck on the same minute it had been when I first glanced at it. When the vehicle behind me accelerated again, close enough that I could see its front grille in detail, I nearly lost control. The grille was contorted in a mocking grin, and its headlights were no longer just headlights. They were glaring, frenzied eyes. I could almost feel them boring into me. Without any clear plan, I jerked the wheel to the right and slammed on the brakes, hoping the other car would speed past or at least veer away. My tires screeched in protest, and my heart pounded so hard I thought my ribs would crack. The sudden stop sent a jolt through my body, and I squeezed my eyes shut, expecting impact. But nothing happened. I opened my eyes and found myself on the shoulder of the highway, my car trembling from the abrupt stop. The engine sputtered, then fell silent. The air felt thick as I looked around. The road was empty, no headlights behind me, no ominous shape looming in the dark. My limbs shook with such intensity that I had trouble unlatching my seatbelt. Eventually, I managed to unbuckle myself. My ears still rang with the sound of screeching tires and my own thudding pulse. For a moment, I allowed hope to seep in. Maybe I had broken out of the loop, escaped that malevolent presence. My chest still burned from panicked breathing, and every nerve in my body was stretched taut. Slowly, I reached for the door handle, intending to get out and gather my bearings. My mouth was so dry I could barely swallow. Then, out of the silence, the radio crackled back to life. I froze, hand on the door, my entire body tense. Static filled the car. That same guttural voice emerged again, telling me the chase was not over, that it could resume at any time. My lungs felt too small for my body, and my vision started to tunnel. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to resist the urge to flee on foot. Where would I run anyway, on a deserted highway that might just loop back on itself? A sudden flicker in the rearview mirror caught my attention. Two distant points of light, faint but unmistakable, appeared far behind me, growing larger by the second. I felt a suffocating dread settle on my shoulders. The pursuer was coming again. The engine of my car made a strangled noise, refusing to turn over when I turned the key in the ignition. My panic surged, and I clutched the steering wheel as those headlights drew nearer, painting the darkness in their unholy glow. In a final act of defiance, I twisted the key with every ounce of strength I had. My car sputtered, then roared back to life with a furious cough. The headlights behind me were now close enough that I could see that twisted grin on the grille. The thought of being caught in that endless loop ignited a spark in me, some desperate sense of survival. I slammed the car into gear and peeled back onto the highway, the tires squealing. My arms shook so badly I could barely steer, but I managed to stay in one lane. The radio hissed. The voice mocked me, said I would never break free. Yet as I sped forward, I noticed that the next exit sign, previously blank, now displayed a number. It was a tiny sliver of hope. My breath hitched, and I felt a surge of adrenaline flood my system. The monstrous vehicle tailgated me again, headlights blazing with maddening intensity. I refused to slow, refused to let it gain any more ground than it already had. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. 1 mile. That's what the exit sign read. If I could just reach it, maybe, just maybe, this nightmare would end. As the ramp approached, the demonic car made a final lunge. I felt a tremor shudder through my vehicle, as though something had struck my rear bumper. My body jolted forward, but I kept my foot on the gas, hands clenched around the wheel. The exit lane opened up, and I swerved onto it, tires wailing in protest. The other car followed, but at the last moment, it skidded sideways, its headlights glaring like furious eyes before vanishing in a swirl of black smoke. I kept driving down the exit ramp, heart still hammering. My fingers twitched with panic, and my breath came in ragged gasps. I could hardly believe what I'd seen, half convinced that if I glanced at the rearview mirror, I'd see it behind me again. But there was nothing except the pale glow of my own taillights reflected against the roadway. When the exit ramp leveled out, I found myself in a quiet intersection lined with dim street lamps. The air felt clearer, lighter, as though that oppressive darkness had retreated. Trembling, I pulled into a small convenience store parking lot, its lights flickering overhead. The place looked closed, but I just needed a moment to breathe, to make sense of whatever had just happened. I shut off the engine and slumped back in my seat, adrenaline still coursing through me. My entire body shook uncontrollably, and cold sweat drenched my back. My mind replayed the events, those warped headlights, the static on the radio, the voice that claimed we were stuck in an endless loop, and the figure in my back seat. The memory of that face lingering behind me, smiling in the darkness, made my stomach clench with renewed terror. Though I felt relieved to have escaped, a nagging doubt burrowed into my mind. The radio's final crackle echoed in my thoughts, hinting that I might not be free forever. I didn't see that monstrosity behind me at the moment, but the fear that it could reappear at any time gnawed at my sanity. No matter how I tried to calm down, I couldn't quite believe I was safe. I sat in the silence of that parking lot, cold and shaking, certain of only one thing. The sense of pursuit had not disappeared. It had simply faded into the shadows, biding its time. Part of me felt that if I started the car again, I might find those headlights in my mirror. My breathing grew uneven just thinking about it. I still drive that road every day for work, though I leave earlier now, refusing to stay past sunset. Sometimes I see headlights behind me and my chest tightens, convinced it's that same demonic vehicle. And sometimes, when I turn on the radio, the static returns, just for a split second, followed by a faint laugh that could be my imagination or something infinitely worse. Every time that happens, I feel like I'm teetering on the edge of that loop, about to be pulled back in. I don't know if I truly escaped, or if this is just a temporary reprieve. The only thing I'm certain of is the chill that crawls along my spine whenever night falls. It's the reminder that out there on those deserted highways, something waits, its headlights prowling the darkness, its voice echoing through the static, eager to resume a chase that might never really end. Story 11. The first time I realized something was truly wrong, I was crouched in the underbrush, camera pressed firmly to my face, heart pounding for reasons I couldn't explain. It was night, that thin hour when the forest is more shadow than substance. A crimson moon hung low, casting an anemic glow through the pines. Every breeze carried a faint rustle that made my skin prickle as if something just out of sight was pacing around me. My breath was shallow and came in short, nervous bursts. It felt like I was being watched, closely, deliberately, long before I ever understood by whom. I'm a nature photographer by trade, the kind who's used to long, solitary hours in uncomfortable environments. Rain-soaked tents, scorching deserts, biting cold up in the mountains. I've endured them all. My goal has always been to capture the hidden lives of animals in their element. I thought I knew the rhythms of the wild, the subtle cues that signal whether an animal feels threatened or relaxed, curious or afraid. But nothing prepared me for the sense of unease that overwhelmed me the day I first encountered that massive red fox. I was in a stretch of dense woodland near my hometown. It's a place I've frequented for years. The fox emerged from behind a rotting log covered in moss, moving with an odd gait that wasn't quite right for any canine I'd ever filmed. Its fur was a deep, vibrant red, the kind that almost glowed in the last golden rays of twilight. At first it looked normal enough. Then it turned its face toward me, and I swear our eyes locked through the camera lens. My stomach twisted, and my fingers went numb. Usually wild animals seem either indifferent or wary, but not this one. It stared back with unsettling intensity, as though it recognized me. I snapped a few shots, heart racing so loudly that I feared I might spook it. But it didn't bolt. It just kept watching me, unblinking. That evening, I hiked back to my car feeling an odd mixture of excitement and dread. I convinced myself that the feeling was adrenaline, the natural high from observing a rare, beautiful creature. Back home in my dimly lit living room, I began reviewing the photos on my laptop. The initial shots showed a large fox crouched by a log, eyes reflective. But in later images, captured while it was wandering near a small clearing, the shape of its torso looked strangely elongated. I zoomed in, my pulse throbbing in my neck. The animal's limbs seemed off, too long or angled in a way that suggested it was half rising on hind legs. There was a blurred impression of something almost human in its silhouette. I felt sweat bead along my forehead, and I wiped it away with the back of my hand. I wanted to dismiss it as a photographic anomaly, perhaps a trick of the light or a glitch from moving too fast. Yet as I went through more frames, the metamorphosis became more pronounced whenever the fox was at a distance. When I showed one of the pictures to a colleague, I only said something about the shutter speed messing up. I didn't mention how it made me feel, a creeping dread, like I was looking at a secret I wasn't meant to witness. I kept returning to the woods, feeling compelled to document this particular fox. My sessions never lasted too long after nightfall. Still, each time the sun dipped below the horizon, The forest carried a heavier sense of apprehension. My footsteps seemed to echo unnaturally, each snap of a twig like the crack of a gunshot. Birds ceased their evening calls earlier than normal. The wind seemed to skitter through the branches instead of flowing smoothly. And always, somewhere in the distance, I'd catch a flash of red fur. If I raised my camera quickly enough, I'd see it turn its head toward me, as if acknowledging my presence with a faint tilt that made my breath catch in my throat. Over time, it became increasingly obvious that the fox was not just wary, it was aware. I felt its gaze tracing me whenever I was out there. My chest would tighten, and I'd feel that clammy sensation of sweat gathering beneath my jacket. Once I could have sworn it smiled, lips curling back in a way that no normal animal's muzzle ever does. That night, my heart hammered so fiercely, I had to pull off the trail to steady myself, gripping a nearby tree trunk until I caught my breath. My dreams soon turned turbulent. At first, they were simple flashes. Me kneeling with my camera, the fox glaring from somewhere behind a thick veil of foliage. Then the dreams intensified. The fox started speaking, but not in the comforting, whimsical manner of children's stories. No, its voice was low, resonant, almost scraping against the inside of my skull. The unsettling part wasn't just that it spoke in perfect English. It was how it revealed intimate knowledge of my life. I'd awake gasping, sweat-soaked sheets tangled around my legs, heart throbbing in my chest. The next morning, I'd piece together the bits I could recall, references to personal regrets, private memories I hadn't shared with anyone. My mouth would go dry as I thought about how specific these details were. They weren't random or vague, but incisive and personal, drawing attention to secrets and insecurities I'd buried. Out of a mixture of fear and fascination, I kept photographing the fox. I needed to be sure I wasn't imagining its unnatural shape. But each new batch of images only heightened my anxiety. When I was alone in the lab processing the pictures, I sometimes noticed the fox standing on two legs at the far edge of the frame. Arms, yes, arms, hanging at its sides in a posture disturbingly human. This shape always receded into the background the moment other people entered the room. I'd point at the screen to show a friend, and the shape would seem to have shifted back into a normal, if large, fox. Every time this happened, my stomach cramped with dread, and a cold sweat broke out along my hairline. Then came the footprints. It started with a set of muddy tracks in my front yard, leading from the curb to my front door. At first I thought it must be a stray dog or a raccoon rummaging for food, but the prints were too large for a raccoon and too narrow for a dog. They had the distinct shape of fox paws, yet double the usual size. My pulse kicked into overdrive when I found more prints right outside my bedroom window on the side of the house. How or why a fox would circle that specific spot, I couldn't explain. My hands trembled as I tried to brush the prints away, as if erasing them would blot out the creeping fear in my mind. Not long after, I discovered paw marks on the steps leading up to the second floor of my house. That made my heart practically stop. It's not just that it was unnatural for a wild animal to climb stairs, but these footprints were spaced in a way that suggested it walked on hind legs. I felt a wave of nausea. My vision dimmed at the edges as I placed my hand on the banister, leaning to steady myself. There, in the weak overhead light, I had to fight the urge to run out of the house screaming. Instead, I forced myself to breathe deeply, my exhalations shaky and ragged. My fingertips tingled with fear as I bent down to examine the paw prints more closely. The indentations had that same elongated shape I'd seen in the photographs. My whole body quaked as I realized there were no trailing prints leading away. Just those marks, like it had stood there for a while, then simply vanished. Over the next few nights, my dreams intensified to the point where I was scared to sleep. The fox's voice, or whatever spoke to me in that shape, tormented me with personal revelations. It mentioned my past embarrassments, describing details I'd long forgotten or hoped never to recall. It implied it had been watching me for years. I would wake in a slick of perspiration, chest tight, mouth parched. Even when I left the house in the middle of the day, I felt like the fox's presence was trailing behind me, step for step. One evening, I was editing images in my home office when a faint noise made me freeze. It was a dragging sound across the wooden deck out back. All the hair on my arm stood on end as I listened. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. The lights in the office flickered, a surge or maybe just my imagination. Slowly, I made my way to the window and lifted the blinds. By the faint glow of my neighbor's porch light, I caught a glimpse of something moving. It was tall, taller than any normal fox, and it moved in a slow, deliberate way that was more bipedal than quadruped. My lungs seized, and I pressed a shaky hand to my chest, willing my heart to slow. It took all my courage to open the back door. My knees felt weak as I stepped out, swallowing down the thick lump in my throat. The air was cold, biting my face. I remember the silence more than anything, that profound hush broken only by the erratic rhythm of my breathing. I circled around the house, shining my flashlight into the shadows. The beam trembled in my unsteady grip, illuminating only the swirling motes of dust and the occasional shape of a chair or potted plant. No sign of the fox, but the wooden deck had fresh marks, long, narrow scratches, as if something had tried to open the back door. A wave of nausea tightened my gut. I took a step back, nearly losing my balance. That night I barely slept. My eyes burned with exhaustion, and my thoughts churned with questions I didn't want to answer. Was this thing an actual fox, some mutant, or something else entirely? Was I losing my mind, or was it truly stalking me? I could still feel that prickling at the back of my neck, as though unseen eyes were drilling into my skull. Friends noticed my jumpiness. If they asked what was wrong, I made vague excuses about stress. I didn't dare tell them about the fox's footprints on my second-floor landing, or the photos that showed it walking upright. It felt too insane. Most nights, I sat up in the living room, lights blazing, the faint hum of the television trying to drown out the memory of that scraping noise outside. Sleep offered no refuge anyway. Each time I drifted off, the fox would appear in my dreams, peering at me from behind a cluster of trees or standing at the foot of my bed, always with that uncanny awareness. I'd sense it speaking, though now the words were distorted, almost more like an echo in my head than an actual voice. It brought up old guilt, times I'd betrayed friends, moments I was ashamed of. The knowledge that it understood me so intimately made my skin crawl. Eventually, I decided I had to confront the fox in person, or at least try to find it and prove something to myself. I couldn't keep living in a perpetual state of dread, jumping at the slightest creak in the house. So I returned to the forest at dusk, camera slung around my neck, and marched to the clearing where I'd last seen it. My heart pounded so wildly it felt like a drum beating out a frantic rhythm in my ribcage. There were no birds singing, no frogs croaking, just an eerie silence that pressed down on me. The light was fading fast, and I could barely see through the tangle of darkened branches. I stood there calling out, but not in words. It was more of a strangled demand for the creature to show itself. My breath rose in white puffs in the chill. I heard the crunch of leaves behind me. Spinning around, I saw the fox. It was massive, fur gleaming like embers in the half-light. Its eyes fixed on me. My throat went dry, and I had to fight the instinct to run. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then it began to rise onto its hind legs with an unnatural grace that made my stomach twist in horror. My mind screamed that this was impossible, that I was hallucinating. My sweat turned ice cold beneath my jacket. I slowly raised my camera, but my hands shook so violently that I couldn't keep the lens steady. The fox, and I hesitate to even call it that anymore, didn't attack. It only watched, head tilting in a vaguely curious way, as though it anticipated my reaction. My heart hammered harder with each passing second. Then I blinked, and in that fraction of a moment, it vanished. There was no rustling of leaves, no snapping of twigs, nothing. I was left standing in that clearing, lungs burning with each ragged breath. I felt both relief and crushing dread. Relief that I wasn't physically harmed. Dread that I'd seen something that defied explanation and seemed intimately interested in me. I left the forest that night without looking back. stumbling over roots and half-rotten logs. Back at my house, I paced the rooms in a haze. Every little noise made me jump. I realized there was only one thing I could do that might break this cycle of fear. I had to stop pursuing the fox. I had to let it go, abandon the photos, and try to erase it from my life. If it truly had some supernatural hold over me, perhaps it would fade if I ceased to acknowledge it. So I gathered my camera gear, every memory card that held its image, and I locked them away in a cabinet. My hands shook while doing this, and my chest felt like it was being squeezed by an invisible vice. Yet some part of me sensed that continuing to chase this creature would only invite it deeper into my life. Over time, the footprints around my house gradually stopped appearing. The nightmares, though still vivid, grew less frequent. I found myself breathing a bit easier, no longer scanning every corner for a flash of red fur. Yet an underlying sense of unease persists. Late at night, I sometimes sit in my darkened living room, the TV's faint glow flickering off the walls. My heartbeat will suddenly jump for no apparent reason, my palms turning clammy. I'll step to the window, half expecting to see a silhouette peering back at me, its eyes reflecting the dim light with an intelligent, predatory gleam. Though I haven't returned to that forest in weeks, I can't stop thinking about what I saw and what it might mean. No matter how many times I try to rationalize the experience, my memories refuse to conform to a simple explanation. I sometimes wonder if I imagined all of it, a product of burnout and an overactive mind. But then, I recall the very real scratches on my deck, the footprints on my second-floor landing, and the awful clarity of those photographs. My heart clenches with a jolt of fear, and I feel the faint prickle of something unseen watching once again. I haven't shared this full story with anyone, not in all its detail. How could I? Yet I'm left with a dread that clings to me like a shadow, reminding me that there are forces in this world, hidden in the glow of a crimson moon or the hush of a silent forest, that defy everything we believe we know about nature. I may never unlock the mystery of that fox, or understand why it chose to reveal itself in such a horrifying way. But sometimes, in the depth of night, when the wind rattles the windows just so, I close my eyes and feel the echo of its gaze, the whisper of its unspoken words, and I'm certain that somewhere out there, in those silent woods, it still waits, fully aware of my every thought, just as it was from the very beginning. Story 12. I remember the night it all began with a suffocating clarity that still makes my stomach churn. The hallway lights in the old humanities building flickered erratically, and every footstep I took down those lonely corridors felt like an intrusion on some forbidden ground. A chill spread through the air in ways the building's ancient heating system could never explain. I'd stayed late, poring over student papers in my cramped office at the far end of the corridor, but my mind was far from the essays. Something heavier pressed in around me, a presence I couldn't quite define. That was the first night I realized I was no longer alone in those hours when most people had already gone home. I am a history professor at a mid-sized university in a quiet town. My work often keeps me after dark, when the lights are low and the echo of my own footsteps is the only sound in the hallway. For years I reveled in that solitude. Some of my best ideas came when the campus was at rest, its daily hum replaced by the hush of emptiness. That hush, however, was broken the day the new janitor arrived. She was introduced at a staff meeting in a casual announcement from administration, who simply mentioned her name and that she'd be handling the nighttime cleaning shift for our department. I didn't pay much attention at first. We often got new maintenance staff as people came and went. But there was a feeling, a nearly imperceptible unease, when I noticed her standing by the door with her mop and bucket, staring at me in a way that felt too fixed, too deliberate. Her face was calm, maybe too calm, and she blinked slowly as if she were testing whether we could truly see her. The next few nights, I started noticing the same pattern. Whenever I stayed late, she would be there, never quite in my office, but somewhere close by. I'd pass her in the corridor, crouched over a small puddle or busily arranging her cleaning supplies, but she would never meet my eye. Yet I felt watched. There's a kind of pressure you feel on the back of your neck when someone is standing too close, even if they're physically several feet away. That subtle prickle of awareness turned the corridors into something claustrophobic. She didn't speak much, not in my presence anyway. The only acknowledgement I usually got was a slow tilt of her head, as if she were almost smiling or almost frowning. At first, the details were small, easy to rationalize. One evening, I realized that her silhouette didn't quite appear where it should have on the wall when I walked past her. For a fleeting moment, under the fluorescent light, there was no shadow stretching out behind her, although my own shadow elongated in front of me. I thought perhaps the lighting angle was off, that she was standing in some tricky angle that made her shadow almost vanish. The rational part of my mind latched onto that explanation, but rationalizations can only last for so long. A few days later, I was asked to review some security footage for an unrelated theft issue. It was a minor incident in the department, a missing piece of equipment. As I scrubbed through the feed, I saw her on the recordings. Or rather, I saw a distortion where she should have been. While everyone else appeared perfectly normal in the footage, her figure showed up as a vague, static-riddled blur. The shape moved through corridors, but there was no clear outline of a person, just a flickering smear, like a camera glitch that stubbornly repeated every time she appeared. I rewound the footage and replayed it repeatedly, my pulse quickening with each pass. I couldn't explain it. I considered that the old camera might just be malfunctioning. Still, I noticed other employees were captured smoothly on the same feed, in the same time frame. The distortion belonged only to her. By then, my nerves were already on edge, but I tried to maintain some professional detachment. After all, I was a historian, someone who values empirical data and reason over superstition. A colleague, in conversation the following morning, suggested that maybe she had found a way to hack the camera or was wearing something reflective that messed with the sensors. The idea sounded desperate and unconvincing, but it was better than nothing. Then came the night I overheard her voice. I'd stayed late again to finalize a paper for publication. The clock on my wall showed almost midnight, and the entire building was silent except for the distant hum of the ventilation system. Suddenly, I realized I wasn't alone. Faintly, from somewhere near the end of the hall, came a sound like whispering. It was not quite English, not quite any language I recognized. Intrigued and uneasy, I walked quietly to investigate. She was standing in a small alcove by the vending machines, her back to me. The corridor lights were half off, so only the dim glow from the machines lit her figure. She was talking to someone on her phone, I assumed at first. But as I got closer, I realized she wasn't holding a phone. She was simply talking, almost chanting. My heart thumped painfully in my chest, and it felt like the blood drained from my face. The language she used scratched at a part of my mind I didn't even know existed. Yet I somehow understood fragments of her words. They spoke of something ancient, primal, something about the watchers in the dark. My breaths came faster, chest tightening, as if my body resisted the meaning behind those words. I stepped back carefully, trying not to be noticed, but the floor creaked under my foot. The chanting stopped abruptly. When I looked again, she was just standing there, silent, her head slightly inclined, as though listening. I backed away and hurried to my office, locking the door behind me. For the rest of that night, I barely breathed, every nerve strained to hear if she was approaching. Over the following weeks, I found reasons to leave earlier whenever possible, but deadlines and departmental responsibilities sometimes forced me to stay. Each time, the tension in my chest would return the moment I noticed her figure in the corridor or heard the echo of her squeaking cleaning cart wheels. My imagination ran wild, painting images of what might happen if she cornered me alone in that deserted building. I started documenting everything. It was a logical approach. Gather evidence to calm or confirm my growing suspicions. I recorded audio on my phone whenever I sensed her presence. In the moment, all I heard were faint footsteps or the squeak of wheels. But the next morning, when I played the files in my office with the door locked, I heard her voice again. The language was the same cryptic chant, but this time it was clearer. My heart hammered so loudly I was sure it would burst. There were phrases about thresholds between worlds, about hunger that cannot be sated. The most horrifying part was that I understood these phrases despite having no background in such languages, if they were even recognized languages at all. I attempted to share the recordings with a trusted colleague in the linguistics department. They told me they heard nothing but static and some low hum. No voice, no chanting. They thought I might be experiencing stress-induced auditory hallucinations. Their polite concern only made my face burn with confusion and embarrassment, and I vowed not to share the evidence again. Yet every time I listened to those files alone, the chanting remained perfectly audible. I couldn't escape it. About a month into this unsettling situation, I made a disturbing discovery regarding objects she touched. One evening, I saw her pick up a fallen stack of posters from the floor. They slipped from her hands for a moment, and she bent down to retrieve them with a calm deliberation. After she left, I walked over to the spot and noticed a slimy, translucent residue on the floor, shimmering under the fluorescent light. My breath stuck in my throat as I bent down to examine it. It was like a viscous film that clung to the linoleum, cool to the touch. I scrambled to find a cotton swab from my office, hoping to collect a sample. The moment I returned, it had vanished. No trace of moisture remained. The floor looked perfectly dry, as if I had imagined the entire thing. My hand shook with a mixture of frustration and alarm. Later, I saw similar slick spots on doorknobs, on a table in the lounge, and once on the edge of my own desk chair. Each time I tried to gather a sample, it disappeared before I could manage it. The sense of violation, knowing she had stood right there, leaving traces of some inexplicable substance, made my skin crawl. Each night, the tension in my chest grew, and my mind felt caught between desperate curiosity and unyielding dread. I became hyper-aware of every noise, every flicker of light. My breath was shallow most of the time. My hands trembled whenever I thought about confronting her. A primal fear churned in my gut, the type of fear that gnaws at your bones and tells you something is deeply wrong. My rational mind receded under the weight of this dread, and I began to doubt everything. Had I somehow attracted her attention by being in the building so late? Was there something about me that caught her interest, or was this always going to happen? I started noticing other staff members avoided her too, though they seemed oblivious to the deeper horror I felt. They just found her unsettling, said she was quiet and odd. Once or twice someone mentioned that she made them feel cold, that it was like a draft followed her. But no one seemed to connect the dots like I did, and I wondered if I was the only one truly seeing her for what she was. My sleep became plagued with nightmares. I dreamed of corridors that stretched into impossibility, halls that twisted like spirals, with the overhead lights swinging and casting no shadow for her figure. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, pulse racing, my chest tight as if I'd just escaped from drowning. Those nightmares bled into my daily life, and I found myself jumpy and paranoid. I'd flinch if someone tapped my shoulder. I no longer felt safe behind my office door, hearing phantom footsteps that might or might not have been hers. One evening, I decided I couldn't endure this silence any longer. I had to confront her, or at least see if she would give some explanation. I waited, hidden in a corner of the corridor near my office, listening for her telltale cartwheels. My breathing was ragged, and my heart pounded so violently that I was afraid she'd hear it. When she finally emerged around the corner, her figure flickered slightly under the dysfunctional light. I remembered noticing again that there was no shadow following her movements. A wave of cold dread tightened around my chest, and I had to force myself to stay put. I stepped forward, clearing my throat. My voice came out shaky as I tried to address her, but it caught in my throat. She turned slowly and faced me. Her eyes, unusually dark in that hallway, were fixed on me with an intensity that made me feel like an insect pinned under a glass. In a voice that resonated as if from deep underground, she asked if I needed help. Or I think that's what she said. Her tone and the shape of her words were so strange, so thick with an accent I couldn't place, that each syllable made my pulse quicken. I stammered something about wanting to ask her a question, but the words came out in a rush of nervous energy. I half expected her to respond with that same cryptic chanting. Instead, she just tilted her head. I tried to mention the strange residue, the shadow that wasn't there, the camera footage, but I ended up sputtering. There was an odd tightness in my throat as if something invisible was gripping it. Her lips curved into a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. Then she turned away and continued down the hallway. I stood there, paralyzed, until I no longer heard the squeaking of her cart. That night, I locked myself in my office, pacing the small space as my heart hammered. The hum of the fluorescent lights sounded sinister in the silence. I felt an urge to run, to flee the building, but a stubborn curiosity kept me there. If I gave in to fear, would I ever have the courage to return? So, I forced myself to stay and do my work, though my nerves were frayed to the point where every rustle of paper sounded like a threat. Around 2 in the morning, after hours of tense silence, I decided to check the security cameras again from my computer. The corridor feeds showed the usual flicker of static in her presence, but there was something else this time. In one feed, she stood in the empty lounge, facing the camera directly. The footage was marred by static, but it almost seemed as though she was reaching out toward the lens. My eyes burned from staring so hard, and I felt my breath hitch when I caught the faint outline of her face in the distortion. She seemed to be mouthing something. My ears started ringing, and even though there was no audio on that particular feed, I swore I heard her chanting in my head. My stomach twisted, and cold sweat broke out on my skin. In that moment, I realized that reason and evidence were meaningless in the face of whatever she was. At the brink of losing my composure, I shut down the camera feed and packed my things in a frantic hurry. My hands shook so badly that I dropped my keys twice. The corridors on my way out felt stifling, as if the walls themselves pressed inward. Every creak and groan of the old building made my heart thunder. I struggled to keep my breathing steady, repeating to myself that I was almost free. When I finally pushed the heavy entrance door open, the cool night air rushed in, and I felt an overwhelming relief, like I'd escaped some suffocating tomb. The next morning, I went straight to administration and feigned a personal issue that required me to do my research from home for a while. I also arranged to have my classes moved to earlier slots, so I wouldn't need to be in the building after dark. My department head granted the request without much fuss. It was easier than trying to explain the truth. That something beyond human comprehension worked the night shift as our janitor, leaving no trace except lingering dread and impossible phenomena. I still had her voice recordings, but I couldn't bring myself to listen to them anymore. They seemed to carry a residue of that environment, as though hearing them would drag me back into that labyrinth of swirling shadows and flickering lights. A part of me feared those recordings might corrupt me further, or that the chanting had an effect on my mind far stronger than I realized. In the weeks that followed, I avoided the building after 5 in the evening. My colleagues noted I seemed anxious, but I offered no explanation. My nightmares lessened, though I couldn't rid myself of the memory of her face, the flicker of static on the screen, the sight of that viscous film on the floor. Even in the safety of daylight, I felt eyes on me whenever I passed a janitorial closet or heard the echo of cartwheels in another hallway. Yet I never saw her again in person. I heard a rumor that the university hired additional cleaning staff. Some said the new hires were for daytime work, and that our original janitor's schedule had changed. The rumor gave me a twisted sense of relief and apprehension. Had she moved on to another building, another department, or another campus? Was she even still here? One evening, about 2 months later, I worked late again for the first time. My hands trembled as I unlocked my office door. The hallway lights buzzed overhead, and every small sound set my teeth on edge. But the hours dragged on without incident. At some point, I found the courage to leave my office and venture toward the vending machines. That's when I saw something on the floor, a small, faint slick of that transparent residue. My heart lurched in my chest. I froze, unable to move as I stared at the glistening mark. Then, right before my eyes, it vanished, as if never there. I felt that old chill claw its way up my spine. My throat went dry, my breath stuttering. Even though I didn't see her, I knew she was somewhere close, or at least her influence remained. There was no question in my mind that her presence lingered, defying any logic I tried to cling to. To this day, I've told no one the full truth of what happened. I carry the images, the voices, and that paralyzing dread with me like a wound that never properly heals. I've learned to function, to maintain a veneer of normalcy in my teaching and research. But every so often, especially if I catch a glimpse of a distorted figure in a security camera or hear a low hum in an empty corridor, my heart races with the certainty that she's still there, always watching, always waiting, existing somewhere just beyond human perception. And I know that if I ever slip into those dark halls again, if I ever linger too long under the flickering lights, her eyes will find me, and I will feel that suffocating presence closing in once more, proof that some doors, once opened, never fully shut, leaving me with the echo of her ancient, unintelligible words reverberating in my mind for as long as I live.